The book known as Leviticus holds within its pages some of the most disputed, poorly grasped, and apparently strange directives found anywhere in the literary history of humanity. We are dealing with a text that demands priests inspect fungus growing on walls, spells out precisely how a goat should be sacrificed, and lays down death sentences for actions that appear minor by today's standards. And yet, this very same book gives us the groundbreaking instruction to love your neighbor exactly as you love yourself. Words that would resonate throughout the teachings of Jesus and eventually form a cornerstone of Western moral philosophy. So, how can a single book appear so outwardly archaic while simultaneously carrying such deep and lasting influence? The key lies in grasping the full narrative that Leviticus actually presents. But before we jump in, if this channel is new to you, think about tapping that like button, though only if you truly appreciate what we create here. And as I always say, I would absolutely love to hear from you. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us your location and what time of day you're watching. It genuinely helps us feel connected as the worldwide community we truly are. I'm grateful you've chosen to join me today. So, with all of that said, let's get started, shall we? The Bridge Book. Why Leviticus serves as the crucial center. Leviticus occupies the central position within the Torah, even though many who read it do so with some reluctance. Following the compelling stories found in Genesis and Exodus, this compilation of regulations and ceremonial practices can feel like an interruption of the flow. However, Leviticus functions as the essential connection between God's deliverance of his people and their eventual journey toward the land of promise. Think about where the narrative actually pauses. The book of Exodus ends with the glory of God flooding the freshly built tabernacle. Divine presence has now taken residence among the people. Yet, this gives rise to a pressing problem. How is it possible for a holy God to live alongside flawed, mortal human beings without that very presence destroying them? The solution reveals itself over the course of 27 chapters, filled with specific directions. Leviticus tackles the most basic question of covenant partnership. God has made the choice to inhabit the same space as humanity, but holiness and sin are incompatible. This book supplies the structure that makes an impossible relationship actually possible. By way of sacrifice, priesthood, ritual purity, and moral conduct, God creates a pathway for his people to come near to him without danger. The name this book carries in Hebrew, Vayikra, translates to, "and he called." This opening expression captures the heart of everything that comes after. From within the tent of meeting, God calls out, inviting both Moses and the people into organized fellowship. Everything in the book springs from this divine reaching out. God wants relationship and furnishes the ways to keep it going. Ancient cultures across the Near East recognized that approaching any deity required careful adherence to protocol. Kings maintained throne rooms governed by particular rules of entrance. Temples featured levels of access that increased in restriction. Leviticus adopts this familiar framework and completely transforms it. Instead of maintaining distance from people, these guidelines establish routes for drawing closer. Every law exists to safeguard and preserve the bond between the holy God and his cherished people. Where Leviticus sits reveals how significant it is. Positioned at the heart of Moses' 5 books, it constitutes the theological core of the entire Torah. Genesis presents and the selection of a people. Exodus tells the story of liberation and covenant formation. Numbers and Deuteronomy record the wilderness wandering and covenant restoration. But Leviticus demonstrates how this covenant operates on a daily basis throughout each year. The book naturally separates into 2 main sections. The first chapters, 1 through 16, concentrate on achieving holiness by ritual actions, sacrifices, priesthood, and ceremonial purity. Chapters 17 through 27 focus on preserving holiness through moral behavior and social fairness. Combined, they offer a complete picture of existence lived in proximity to the holy. This organization points to a deep reality. Relationship with God encompasses both upward and outward dimensions. The system of sacrifice handles the God-directed component, dealing with wrongdoing and creating communion. The Holiness Code carries this outward into relationships between people, revealing that authentic holiness reaches into every sphere of existence. Contemporary readers frequently find the detailed regulations challenging. Why would God concern himself with combinations of fabric or methods of cooking? These particulars fulfill a broader function. They train the people in the practice of holiness. Each meal, every piece of clothing, each passing day offers a chance to recall their identity as a set-apart people reserved for divine intentions. The directions about sacrifice can appear foreign to modern sensibilities, yet they speak to needs that are universal across humanity. The burden of guilty conscience, the longing for restored relationship, the impulse toward thanksgiving. The different offerings supply structured channels for working through these profound emotions and spiritual truths. Rather than meaningless ceremony, they provide significant psychological and theological healing. Leviticus also puts in place the concept of mediation. The priestly class functions as a connector between the holy God and ordinary people. This position carries both honor and risk. As the book makes dramatically clear, the priesthood does not exist to manufacture distance, rather to make access easier, assisting regular people as they navigate the overwhelming presence of the divine. The idea of blood runs like a current through these chapters. Modern audiences may find this disturbing, but the ancient world viewed blood as the very essence of life itself. Within Leviticus, blood transforms into the God-appointed vehicle of atonement, forming a potent symbol of life surrendered to protect life. This lays the theological foundation for developments later in biblical thought. The regulations about purity create divisions between clean and unclean, holy and ordinary. These separations reach beyond simple cleanliness to build a symbolic world. They instruct the people to discern the distinction between life and death, order and disorder, the everyday and the sacred. Ordinary living becomes an ongoing lesson in spiritual awareness. Standing at the center of the book is the Day of Atonement, the most sacred day in their calendar. This yearly reset offers communal purification for the whole nation. No personal sacrifices prove sufficient for the accumulated burden of collective wrongdoing. Only a unique ceremony conducted by the high priest in the innermost sacred area can restore cosmic equilibrium. The Holiness Code in the later chapters anchors elevated theology in hands-on ethics. Love directed toward God shows itself in love directed toward neighbor. Holiness emerges in truthful business dealings, attention to vulnerable people, and equitable social systems. The same God who lays out sacrificial requirements also instructs them to leave grain behind for the poor and to treat foreigners with compassion. Leviticus introduces revolutionary principles about economics. The sabbatical and jubilee years block the endless buildup of both wealth and poverty. Land goes back to the original families. Debts meet cancellation. These regulations acknowledge that economic fairness mirrors divine character just as truly as correct worship does. The book wraps up with blessings and curses, setting before the people an unambiguous choice. Loyalty results in abundance, protection, and divine nearness. Disobedience brings catastrophe, displacement, and desertion. These outcomes stem not from random divine fury, but from the inherent results of shattering covenant relationship. All throughout Leviticus, one theme surfaces again and again. Holiness means being separate, unique, different. For the ancient nation of Israel, this uniqueness served an outreach function. By conducting their lives according to God's directions, they would put his character on display for the nations around them. Their very way of existing would bear witness to an alternative mode of being human. The regulations in Leviticus molded an entire generation during the wilderness period. Former slaves were learning to think and function as free individuals under divine authority. The everyday routines of sacrifice and purity established rhythm and purpose during their desert travels. What could look like oppressive regulations actually supplied framework and identity for a people discovering who they were. Prophets in later times would both uphold and challenge the Levitical structure. They denounced hollow ritual, separated from justice and compassion. Yet they never dismissed the foundational principles. Instead, they called the people back to the core of Leviticus, that holiness includes both proper worship and righteous living. Writers of the New Testament, especially the one who wrote Hebrews, would interpret Leviticus through the perspective of fulfillment. They recognized the sacrificial structure pointing ahead to a greater truth. The core principles endure while the particular practices undergo transformation. The summons to holiness echoes across the ages, assuming fresh forms, yet carrying the same fundamental message. Even today, Leviticus keeps speaking. Its picture of an equitable society poses a challenge to modern economics. Its weaving together of worship and ethics stands against both hollow religious performance and purely secular morality. Its claim that holiness touches all aspects of life pushes back against the contemporary division between sacred and secular realms. The Book of Leviticus stands as far more than some ancient handbook of ritual. It lays out an all-encompassing vision of life, conducted in relationship with the Holy God. It takes with utmost seriousness both human weakness and divine holiness, supplying a means for the two to intersect. In accomplishing this, it provides enduring wisdom regarding the cost and the magnificence of authentic communion with the divine. The call from the tent, establishing the scene at Mount Sinai. From inside the tent of meeting, the voice rang out, calling Moses by his name. With this straightforward opening, the book of Leviticus sets its distinctive character among the biblical writings. Unlike the sweeping story arcs of Genesis or the dramatic rescue account in Exodus, this book delivers the unmediated speech of God, instruction upon instruction, creating the framework for holy existence. Mount Sinai rises up in the background, that formidable mountain where God came down amid fire and smoke. The people of Israel stay camped at its foundation. No longer enslaved people running from Egypt, yet not the established nation they are destined to become. Within this in-between space, suspended between slavery and fulfillment, they receive the directions that will mold their collective identity for generations ahead. The tabernacle stands finished at the camp center, its golden surfaces catching the desert sunlight. This portable place of worship embodies a stunning reality. The God of the heavens and the earth has selected to make his dwelling among his people. The cloud marking divine presence hovers above the sacred tent during daylight hours, shifting to fire when night falls. God is unmistakably there. Yet this presence carries danger alongside blessing. The same glory that guided them out of Egypt possesses the power to consume them in a heartbeat. The people absorbed this lesson during their encounter with God at Sinai. They pleaded with Moses to act as go-between, frightened by the unfiltered divine voice. Now, God speaks from within the tabernacle, still overwhelming yet more reachable. The tent of meeting fulfills multiple roles in Israel's encampment. Here, Moses meets God directly, face to face, receiving directions for the people. Here, the priests will present daily sacrifices, keeping the connection intact between heaven and earth. Here, the people will carry their offerings, their wrongdoings, their expressions of gratitude. This tent becomes the axis mundi, the central point where divine and human spheres meet. The Hebrew term for holiness, kadosh, shows up repeatedly all through Leviticus. This idea extends beyond moral cleanliness or religious commitment. To be holy is to be separated, unique, other. God is holy because he exists completely apart from creation while deciding to interact with it. Israel attains holiness by being set apart from other peoples for unique relationship with this God. Holiness establishes categories and limits. The tabernacle itself illustrates this principle through its graduated sacred areas. The outer courtyard welcomes every Israelite. The holy place limits entrance to priests. The most holy place, concealed behind the curtain, stays off limits to everyone except the high priest, and even he may enter only once per year. Space itself becomes a teacher of theology. Time, likewise, carries the mark of holiness in Leviticus. The Sabbath day stands separate from the remaining 6. Festival periods mark the farming year with sacred celebrations. The 7th year delivers rest to the land itself. The 50th year, the Jubilee, reorders social and economic ties. Through these boundaries in time, God stakes his claim over time itself. The directions that follow respond to a pastoral worry. How will this holy God dwell among an unholy people? The solution involves an intricate web of sacrifices, purifications, and moral demands. These are not random rules, but gracious gifts. They forge safe routes for approaching what cannot be approached. Peoples throughout the ancient Near East grasped the danger posed by divine presence. Their stories told of deities who wiped out humans for slight offenses or pure caprice. Temple procedures evolved to shield both deity and worshipper from hazardous contact. Leviticus shares this recognition of divine danger, but reshapes it through covenant relationship. The God speaking from the tent is the identical God who heard Israel's cries while in Egypt. He has demonstrated his love through rescue. Now he supplies the methods for ongoing relationship. Every regulation flows from divine yearning for closeness rather than separation. Even the harshest punishments function to protect the community's capacity to host God's presence. Moses functions as the main receiver of these directions, yet they target all of Israel. The recurring phrase, "Speak to the people of Israel," highlights the democratic quality of this revelation. Unlike neighboring cultures where only priests hold sacred knowledge, every Israelite learns the demands of holiness. Children mature understanding how to come near to God. The setting at Sinai influences how we interpret these regulations. This is wilderness legislation for a nomadic people. They possess no territory, cultivate no crops, construct no lasting buildings. Yet God offers directions for settled farming existence. The regulations look ahead to a future realization, preparing the people for a destiny they have not yet attained. The portable quality of the tabernacle speaks to this transitional moment. Unlike the enormous temples of Egypt or Mesopotamia, this sanctuary travels with the people. God commits to journey alongside them through whatever terrain lies in front. The holy presence that appears so fixed and exacting actually turns out to be remarkably flexible and movable. The directions emerge through divine speech rather than human exploration. Moses does not scale the mountain to extract wisdom from unwilling deities. God reaches out, making contact first, providing what humans could never create on their own. This revelatory quality sets biblical law apart from human legal systems that develop through experimentation and failure. Yet the regulations display remarkable awareness of human nature and social circumstances. They recognize the facts of wrongdoing, disagreement, sickness, and mortality. Rather than requiring impossible flawlessness, they supply ways of handling unavoidable shortcomings. The God who speaks understands the creatures he addresses. The covenant framework keeps these regulations from degenerating into mere religious mechanics. God starts by reminding Israel of their liberation from bondage. The regulations spring from relationship instead of generating it. Compliance expresses thankfulness and sustains companionship rather than purchasing divine approval. Grace comes before law in the biblical sequence. The exactness of the directions can overwhelm contemporary readers. Why does God care about the exact method for sacrificing a goat or the precise formula for incense? This precision fulfills multiple goals. It stops improvisation that could prove dangerous. It guarantees equal access by clarifying the requirements. It conveys the reality that every aspect of life matters to God. The tent of meeting, from which God's voice comes, establishes a model for sanctuaries that follow. When Solomon constructs the temple, he adheres to the tabernacle's fundamental design on a more magnificent scale. Even in the present day, religious buildings often mirror these ancient separations of sacred territory. The voice from the tent continues influencing how we picture divine-human meeting. The wilderness context adds poignancy to these directions. A people lacking a homeland receives regulations for permanent settlement. Wanderers study agricultural guidelines. Former slaves rehearse the behaviors of freedom. The distance between current circumstances and future promise demands faith. The regulations themselves transform into expressions of hope. The communal character of the directions deserves highlighting. While individuals carry personal offerings, the system targets corporate holiness. The wrongdoings of a single person impact the whole camp. The loyalty of the community permits God's ongoing presence. This interconnectedness pushes back against modern individualism. As Leviticus opens, the glory cloud settles on the tabernacle. God has established residence among his people. But this tremendous privilege demands careful upkeep. The voice from the tent delivers the operating manual for hosting infinite holiness within finite human community. What comes next may look like tedious regulation, but it represents something far greater. The divine longing to inhabit the same space as humanity and the gracious supply of methods to make this achievable. The sacrificial system, Part 1. The logic behind the altar. The altar occupied its place in the tabernacle courtyard, its bronze exterior darkened by innumerable offerings. Day following day, the smoke from sacrifice climbed toward the sky, forming a vertical connection between earth and heaven. To those with modern minds, this arrangement of animal offerings could appear primitive or harsh. Yet for ancient Israel, the altar stood for God's gracious supply, for handling the fact of sin and the human requirement for connection with the divine. Leviticus begins with thorough directions for 5 main categories of sacrifice. Each fulfills a separate function, responding to different facets of the divine-human relationship. Together, they constitute a thorough system for working through guilt, conveying gratitude, making restitution, and keeping fellowship with God. Far from random ceremony, these offerings supply organized methods for managing the deepest human feelings and spiritual requirements. The burnt offering, or olah, appears first in the Sacred Instruction Manual. The Hebrew term means that which ascends, pointing to the smoke rising toward heaven. This sacrifice requires the total burning of an animal on the altar. Nothing goes back to the person offering it. Everything transforms into smoke and ash. The burnt offering stands for complete commitment, total surrender to God. A person could carry a burnt offering for different reasons. Sometimes it communicated general devotion, a longing to come close to God. Other times, it responded to the unclear sense of guilt that troubles human awareness. When someone experienced the burden of unnamed wrongdoing or simply wanted to give honor to God, they carried an animal to the altar for full consecration. The guidelines identify acceptable animals: musset, cattle, sheep, goats, or birds for those unable to afford larger creatures. This sliding scale guarantees that poverty never blocks someone from approaching God. A person of means might present a bull, while someone with modest resources brings a dove. The attitude of the heart counts more than the magnitude of the gift. The grain offering, or mincha, supplies a bloodless option. The person offering brings fine flour combined with oil and frankincense. One portion burns on the altar, while what remains goes to the priests. This offering frequently went alongside burnt offerings, but could stand by itself. It stands for the product of human work, the effort of hands changed into worship. The Hebrew term mincha usually means gift or tribute. When subjects carried mincha to a king, they recognized his rule. The grain offering operates similarly in the divine-human relationship. It acknowledges God as the origin of all supply, giving back to him a share of his gifts. The addition of frankincense introduces an element of expense and pleasant smell. The peace offering, or shelomim, marks fellowship and completeness. Unlike the burnt offering, the majority of the animal goes back to the person offering it for a celebratory meal. Only specific portions, the fat and internal organs, burn on the altar. The breast and right thigh belong to the priests. Everything else becomes food for a joyful feast shared with family and friends. This offering could commemorate special occasions, 17s, answered requests, significant vows, or straightforward thanksgiving. It changes sacrifice into celebration. The person offering literally shares a meal with God, with portions allocated to the altar, the priests, and the people. This shared dimension makes the peace offering unique among the sacrifices. The sin offering, or chatat, responds to particular violations of God's instructions. When someone becomes aware they have broken divine law, whether purposefully or by accident, this sacrifice supplies cleansing. The blood of the animal assumes a vital role, applied to different parts of the sanctuary, depending on how serious the sin is and who commits it. The ceremony varies depending on who commits the wrongdoing. A priest's violation demands a bull and complex blood manipulation, recognizing that spiritual leaders' wrongdoings affect the whole community. A common person carries a goat or lamb. The poor may present birds or even flour. Again, the system makes room for economic reality while keeping the principle that sin demands attention. The guilt offering, or asham, handles wrongdoings that produce measurable harm. When someone cheats another person, harms property, or violates sacred items, they must make restitution plus 20%. The guilt offering goes along with this payment, addressing both the horizontal damage to humans and the vertical offense against God. This offering acknowledges that some wrongdoings create tangible harm, requiring tangible repair. Expressing regret does not replace stolen goods. Feeling remorse does not rebuild broken relationships. The guilt offering demands practical restoration alongside spiritual reconciliation. It anchors forgiveness in actual justice. The positioning of these directions at Leviticus's beginning signals their weight. Before tackling priesthood, purity, or ethics, God supplies the method for managing sin and keeping relationship. The sacrificial system exists as the base for everything coming after. Without it, the holy God could not inhabit space among sinful people. Each offering requires specific steps that could appear tedious to casual readers. The person offering must place hands on the animal's head, identifying with the substitute. The blood must be managed precisely, applied to exact spots. The portions for burning must be carefully chosen. These particulars matter because approaching God matters. The idea of substitution courses throughout the system. The animal dies in the sinner's place. Its blood supplies cleansing the human cannot accomplish. This concept would turn out to be revolutionary in religious history. Instead of requiring human sacrifice like surrounding cultures, Israel's God accepts animal substitutes. Life is maintained through symbolic death. The priests function as essential mediators in this process. They inspect the animals for imperfections. They carry out the blood ceremonies. They keep the altar fire going. They consume the assigned portions. Without priests, the sacrificial system cannot operate. Yet they, too, require atonement, bringing offerings for their own wrongdoings before assisting others. The daily pattern of sacrifice establishes a pulse of worship in Israel's existence. Morning and evening, the burnt offerings climb upward. All through the day, individuals carry their different offerings. The altar never cools down. The smoke rises without stopping. The relationship between God and people receives continual attention and renewal. Contemporary readers frequently focus on what appears violent or bloody about the system. The ancient world perceived it differently. In a culture where animals supplied food, clothing, and labor, presenting one to God stood for significant economic sacrifice. The death of the animal was already woven into daily existence. The sacrificial system changes routine slaughter into sacred ceremony. The emotional aspects of sacrifice merit consideration. Picture a person bearing the burden of guilt, aware they have broken God's law or injured their neighbor. They choose an animal from their flock, perhaps one they have raised from infancy. They travel to the sanctuary, place hands on the familiar head, and observe as its life drains away. The physical nature of the ceremony matches the heaviness of the spiritual reality. Similarly, imagine the joy accompanying a peace offering. A family saves for months to afford a fitting sacrifice. They journey to the tabernacle with excitement. Following the ritual, they feast on meat they seldom taste, honoring God's goodness with their community. The sacrifice becomes not burden but blessing, not loss but gain. The sacrificial system also fulfills teaching functions. It instructs about the gravity of wrongdoing. Every violation costs something. It shows the value of atonement. Relationship with God justifies considerable expense. It rehearses core theological realities through repeated ceremonial action. The people learn through doing, not simply through hearing. Critics sometimes write off ancient sacrifice as primitive superstition, yet the Levitical arrangement displays notable sophistication. It responds to universal human requirements through culturally particular methods. It supplies psychological release for guilt, social systems for restitution, and communal celebrations of divine grace. It treats seriously both human weakness and divine holiness. As we examine these ancient directions, we catch sight of a God who wants relationship above everything. He could have stayed distant, requiring perfection before approach. Instead, he furnishes multiple routes for flawed humans to come near. Each offering stands for divine accommodation to human need. The altar exists not as obstacle but as connection. The sacrificial system would mold Israel's worship for more than 1,000 years. Even following the temple's ruin, its principles would shape Jewish and Christian theology. The language of sacrifice, atonement, and offering fills scripture and ceremony. What starts with detailed directions about bulls and goats ultimately indicates profound realities about divine love and human need. The sacrificial system, Part 2. Blood, life, and atonement. Blood courses throughout the pages of Leviticus, marking the altar, staining the sanctuary, forming a crimson thread, binding the whole sacrificial system together. To modern sensibilities, this emphasis on blood could appear macabre or primitive. Yet, within the biblical understanding, blood carries deep theological meaning that extends far beyond simple ritual practice. The ancient grasp begins with a straightforward observation. When blood exits the body, life exits as well. This link between blood and life shows up universally across cultures. But Leviticus takes this observation and reshapes it into theological principle. For the life of the flesh exists in the blood, chapter 17 declares, laying the groundwork for everything that follows. This identification of blood with life accounts for its sacred standing in Israelite thinking. Blood belongs to God as the creator of life. Humans may take animal life for nourishment, but the blood must go back to the divine source. It pours at the altar's base or covers the sacred furnishings. Never does it become human food. This ban reaches even to wild game, whose blood must be buried with earth. The sacrificial system builds on this base. Since blood equals life and wrongdoing deserves death, blood becomes the channel of atonement. The Hebrew term kafar, frequently translated as atonement, literally means to cover or wipe away. Blood covers wrongdoing, establishing a protective shield between human guilt and divine judgment. It wipes clean the stain that would otherwise trigger destruction. When the priest gathers blood in sacred containers and applies it to particular locations, he carries out more than hollow ceremony. Each movement holds meaning. Blood on the altar horns purifies the location where heaven and earth intersect. Blood sprinkled in front of the veil cleanses the boundary between holy and most holy. Blood on the mercy seat atones for the very presence of God among sinful people. The systematic application follows a geography of holiness. Wrongdoings by common people demand blood on the outer altar. Wrongdoings by priests require blood inside the holy place. Wrongdoings touching the whole nation call for blood in the most holy place. The deeper wrongdoing penetrates into sacred territory. The deeper blood must go to purify it. This graduated arrangement shows how wrongdoing operates, like pollution, contaminating whatever it contacts. Personal wrongdoing pollutes the wrongdoer. Priestly wrongdoing pollutes the sanctuary. National wrongdoing corrupts the very dwelling place of God. Without regular purification, the buildup of contamination would compel God to vacate his residence among the people. Blood functions as divine cleanser, washing away the pollution that endangers covenant relationship. But this purification carries a price, the life of an innocent replacement. The animal has done no wrong, yet its life drains out to handle human violation. This substitutionary principle runs all through Leviticus, laying the theological groundwork for later biblical developments. The mechanics of sacrifice strengthen this theology. When people offering place hands on the animal's head, they shift their identity to the substitute. When the animal dies, it dies as their representative. When its blood flows, it carries their guilt away. The physical ceremony enacts a spiritual exchange, visible actions achieving invisible outcomes. Different sacrifices use blood differently, each variation teaching separate truths. The burnt offering's blood splashes against every side of the altar, indicating complete consecration. The sin offering's blood touches particular points, targeting specific contamination. The guilt offering's blood follows the sin offering design but goes with tangible restitution. The peace offering presents a distinctive case. Here, blood enables celebration instead of expiation. It creates the conditions for companionship between God and humans. Only after blood secures the relationship can the festive meal begin. Even joyful fellowship demands the foundation of sacrificial atonement. The daily sacrifices create a pattern of blood application. Every morning and evening, blood marks the altar. Every festival multiplies the flow. The Day of Atonement reaches its peak with the high priest entering the most holy place carrying blood, applying it to the mercy seat where God's presence dwells most powerfully. This yearly ceremony supplies corporate purification for built-up contamination. The priests handling blood receive special consecration. At their ordination, blood touches their right ear, thumb, and toe, marking their whole being for sacred work. They dress in linen garments while working with blood, preserving ritual purity. They wash following each sacrifice, acknowledging the tremendous responsibility of standing between life and death. The blood prohibition stretches beyond sacrifice to everyday meals. Israelites must drain blood from all meat, pouring it on the ground like water. This ongoing practice reinforces the sacredness of life. Every meal becomes a reminder that life belongs to God. Even domestic slaughter follows sacred principles. The treatment of blood sets Israel apart from neighboring peoples. While neighbors might consume blood for power or employ it for fortune-telling, Israel reserves it exclusively for atonement. This unique practice marks them as different, holy, set apart. Their distinctive relationship with blood mirrors their distinctive relationship with the God of life. Contemporary readers frequently wrestle with blood sacrifice, viewing it as primitive or harsh. Yet the system actually constrains violence while recognizing its reality. In a world where animals die daily for food and clothing, sacrifice transforms necessary death into meaningful ceremony. It takes what is ordinary and renders it sacred. The psychological dimensions warrant thought. Guilt produces internal pollution that abstract forgiveness cannot always purify. The physical act of sacrifice, choosing the animal, journeying to the sanctuary, witnessing its death, supplies tangible resolution for abstract guilt. The expense reinforces the seriousness, while the blood provides visible purification. The shared aspects also count. When priests work with blood on behalf of others, they show that atonement is not solely individual. The community shares in preserving the conditions for God's presence. Everyone gains from the blood ceremonies that keep the sanctuary pure and the relationship whole. Blood also fulfills a protective role. On Passover night, blood on the doorframes protected Israelite homes from destruction. In the sanctuary, blood on the sacred furnishings shields from the pollution of wrongdoing. Blood establishes a barrier between holiness and contamination, maintaining both the divine presence and human existence. The careful guidelines about blood teach reverence for life itself. Life is not cheap or disposable. It belongs to God and returns to God. Humans may receive temporary care over animal life, but ultimate ownership stays divine. The blood regulations inscribe this theology into everyday practice. As Israel enters the land, these blood guidelines will set them apart from Canaanite behaviors. While neighbors spill human blood in child sacrifice, Israel replaces with animals. While others consume blood for magical power, Israel reserves it for atonement. Their treatment of blood becomes testimony to their separate understanding of life, death, and divine relationship. The prophets will later challenge sacrifice separated from ethics, but they never dismiss the principle of blood atonement. They grasp that external ceremony must connect with internal truth. Blood on the altar signifies nothing without justice in the marketplace. Yet justice without atonement likewise fails. The two must function together. The New Testament will reshape this theology while keeping its core. The letter to the Hebrews states that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness, but it indicates a greater sacrifice that concludes all sacrifices. The principle remains while the practice transforms. Blood still marks the boundary between death and life, judgment and mercy. For ancient Israel, blood on the altar stood for hope. Despite their failures, relationship with God stayed possible. Despite their contamination, purification was accessible. Despite deserving death, life continued through substitution. The crimson flow communicated not divine cruelty but divine mercy, supplying a way through the seemingly impossible problem of holy God dwelling with unholy people. The priesthood ordained, the consecration of Aaron and sons. 7 days of ceremony would change ordinary men into connectors between heaven and earth. As chapter 8 of Leviticus opens, Moses assembles the whole congregation to observe an unprecedented event. Aaron and his sons stand prepared to experience the complex consecration ritual that will create the priesthood for generations ahead. The preparation starts with washing, a complete body cleansing that symbolizes the total purification required for those who will manage holy items. Moses carries basin and water, washing Aaron and his sons from head to toe. This physical purification stands for spiritual preparation. Those who will stand between God and people must themselves be pure. Next arrives the vesting. Well, as Moses dresses Aaron in the splendid garments made according to divine specification, the white linen tunic goes on first, the symbol of purity. Then the sash, woven with blue and purple and scarlet. The robe of the ephod comes next. Blue like the sky, with golden bells and pomegranates decorating its lower edge. Over this, the ephod itself, that mysterious garment holding the breastpiece with 12 stones, standing for Israel's tribes. The turban crowns Aaron's head, and on it, Moses attaches the golden plate engraved with the words, "Holy to the Lord." This statement summarizes the high priest's fundamental nature: set apart, consecrated, belonging wholly to God. When Aaron enters the sanctuary, he wears this identity, literally written across his forehead. The anointing oil flows next, that sacred blend whose formula appears earlier in Exodus. Moses pours it over Aaron's head, the oil running down his beard, down to the collar of his robes. This anointing does more than symbolize. It achieves a transformation. The ordinary becomes extraordinary through the application of sacred oil. Aaron's sons receive simpler garments, tunics, sashes, and caps. They will function as assistants to their father, learning the intricate ceremonies, keeping the sacred fire, managing the offerings carried by the people. Their consecration, while less elaborate than Aaron's, still separates them from the common population for divine work. Now starts the sacrifice sequence that will finish their ordination. First, a bull for a sin offering. Aaron and his sons place their hands on its head, identifying with the animal, shifting their need for atonement. Moses conducts the sacrifice, taking the blood and applying it to the altar's horns, purifying the location where these new priests will serve. The blood ceremony deserves careful notice. Moses puts blood on Aaron's right earlobe, right thumb, and right big toe. Then he duplicates the process for each son. This marks their whole being, what they hear, what they handle, where they walk, as belonging to sacred service. Blood consecrates them from head to toe for their priestly responsibilities. A ram for burnt offering comes next. It's totally consumed on the altar. This stands for the priest's complete dedication to God. They hold nothing back. Their lives climb like smoke toward heaven. Then arrives a second ram, the ram of ordination, whose blood combines with oil to form a consecrating mixture that Moses sprinkles on the priests and their garments. The ceremony includes a distinctive ritual. Moses positions portions of the sacrifice, fat, kidneys, liver, right thigh, together with bread, cake, and wafer, into the hands of Aaron and his sons. They raise these offerings before the Lord, then return them to Moses for burning. Their hands literally grasp the elements of their consecration, physically holding their new role. For 7 days, this process repeats. The priests stay within the tabernacle court, neither entering the holy place nor going back to common life. They exist in-between space, no longer ordinary Israelites, but not yet functioning priests. Each day brings repeated sacrifices, repeated meals of consecrated food, repeated reminders of their transformation. The 8th day comes with fresh significance. Now Aaron himself assumes control, presenting sacrifices for his own wrongdoings and for the people. The student becomes the instructor. The consecrated becomes the consecrator. Moses steps aside as Aaron steps forward into his appointed role as high priest of Israel. But celebration shifts to tragedy in chapter 10. Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's oldest sons, take their censers and present strange fire before the Lord. Fire he had not instructed. Divine fire flashes from the sanctuary, consuming them instantly. Their bodies lie before the altar, where moments earlier they had ministered. The text supplies no thorough explanation for their particular violation. Perhaps they employed common fire instead of altar fire. Perhaps they entered the sanctuary at an improper moment. Perhaps they acted while intoxicated. Whatever the exact transgression, they failed to honor the boundaries of holiness. Moses speaks sternly to the stunned Aaron. This is what the Lord meant when he said, "Through those who are near me I will show myself holy, and before all the people I will be glorified." Aaron stays silent, his grief absorbed under the burden of divine holiness. The priesthood starts with both glory and terror. The aftermath strengthens the lesson. Moses forbids Aaron and his remaining sons from mourning publicly. They cannot exit the sanctuary or tear their garments. The priests belong to God more than to family. Their cousins carry out the bodies, while Aaron continues the day's prescribed offerings. Sacred responsibility supersedes personal grief. God speaks directly to Aaron for the first time, prohibiting priests from consuming wine or strong drink when entering the tent of meeting. They must keep clear minds to distinguish between holy and common, clean and unclean. The priesthood requires constant alertness. One moment's carelessness can prove fatal. The incident with Nadab and Abihu casts a shadow over the priesthood's inauguration. It shows that proximity to the holy brings privilege, but also danger. Those who serve at the altar live constantly at the meeting point of life and death. They manage the same fire that can either accept offerings or consume those offering. Yet the priesthood continues. Aaron and his surviving sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, carry on the daily service. They present the morning and evening sacrifices. They instruct the people in the statutes God has given. They function as living reminders that approaching the holy requires mediation, preparation, and careful following of divine direction. The consecration ceremony created patterns that would last for centuries. Each fresh generation of priests would experience similar rituals. The washing, vesting, anointing, and blood application would mark them as set apart. The 7-day separation would shift them from common to sacred standing. The priest's role reached beyond ritual performance. They functioned as teachers, interpreting God's law for everyday existence. They diagnosed skin conditions and declared people clean or unclean. They assessed property for redemption and evaluated vows. They kept the sanctuary and its furnishings. They embodied the meeting point of heaven and earth in practical service. The demand that priests be without physical imperfection speaks to their representative function. They stand before God on behalf of the people, and before the people on behalf of God. Their wholeness symbolizes the perfection demanded in divine presence, yet they too need atonement, presenting offerings for their own wrongdoings before serving others. The priesthood formed a necessary buffer between infinite holiness and finite humanity. Without priests, the people could not approach. Without proper consecration, even priests faced mortal risk. The elaborate ordination ceremonies acknowledged this reality while supplying safe passage across the divide. Later prophets would challenge corrupt priests who twisted their office for profit. Kings would clash with priests over sacred authority. The destruction of the temple would terminate the sacrificial system. Yet, the principle of priesthood, the need for mediation between holy God and sinful humanity, would persist in transformed forms. The book of Hebrews would declare all believers priests, able to approach God directly. Yet it would also indicate the ultimate high priest who needs no consecration, presents no sin offering for himself, and lives forever to intercede. The Levitical priesthood, with all its glory and limitation, prepared the conceptual ground for this greater reality. For ancient Israel, the consecration of Aaron and his sons marked a pivotal moment. God had supplied not only the means of sacrifice, but also the mediators to carry it out. The priesthood stood as a gracious gift, enabling continued relationship despite the vast distance between divine holiness and human weakness. Through washing, vesting, anointing, and blood, ordinary men became extraordinary servants, maintaining the vital link between heaven and earth, pure and impure, the cosmic categories of clean and unclean. The divisions started with creation itself. Light separated from darkness, waters above from waters below, land from sea. In the same manner, chapters 11 through 15 of Leviticus create fundamental distinctions that would shape Israelite existence: clean and unclean, pure and impure. These categories went far beyond primitive hygiene to build a symbolic universe where daily choices reinforced spiritual realities. The dietary regulations appear first. Those famous restrictions that would mark Jewish identity through millennia. Yet the text offers no explanations for why some animals qualify as food while others do not. The cow is clean, the pig unclean. Fish with fins and scales may be eaten, but shellfish must be shunned. Birds of prey are forbidden, while doves are permitted. The categories simply exist, requiring acceptance rather than comprehension. Contemporary readers frequently seek hygienic reasons for these distinctions. Perhaps pork spoiled quickly in the desert heat. Perhaps shellfish carried disease. While health benefits may have resulted from the restrictions, the text itself never references them. The divisions fulfill a different purpose altogether. They create a disciplined people who think before they eat, who recognize that not everything available is suitable. The basic principle appears to involve wholeness and proper spheres. Land animals that chew cud and split hooves represent the norm for their domain. Sea creatures with fins and scales embody proper fish characteristics, creatures that blur categories. Shellfish, that live in water but crawl like land animals, pigs that split hooves but don't chew cud, fall outside acceptable limits. This systematic classification trains Israel to recognize distinctions. Every meal becomes an exercise in discernment. Is this clean or unclean? Does it fit the proper pattern? The dietary regulations create a people practiced in making distinctions, prepared to distinguish between holy and common in weightier matters. The regulations reach beyond diet to touch. Certain animals render anyone who touches their carcasses temporarily unclean. This impurity spreads to objects and requires washing and time to resolve. The invisible contamination transfers through contact, teaching that spiritual realities can be communicated through physical interaction. Human bodily functions receive extensive treatment in these chapters. Childbirth renders a woman unclean for a period, depending on the child's gender. Skin diseases require priestly inspection and potential isolation. Bodily discharges, both regular and irregular, create temporary impurity. These regulations recognize the complicated truths of physical existence while upholding the boundaries essential for holy space. The rules concerning skin conditions, often translated as leprosy in older versions, show especially intricate detail. The priests function as experts in diagnosis, inspecting marks and wounds, monitoring whether they spread or heal. Someone afflicted might need to stay isolated beyond the camp's borders, calling out unclean as a warning to others. And yet, the framework also makes room for restoration, with detailed ceremonies marking someone's return to the community. We must not confuse these purity regulations with sin. Becoming unclean through childbirth or a woman's monthly cycle carries no moral guilt. These conditions are natural, frequently unavoidable, and sometimes even blessed. A woman enters uncleanness through the sacred act of giving birth to new life. The categories of clean and unclean function on a separate plane from righteous and wicked. Rather, this purity framework establishes concentric rings of holiness. At the very center sits the most holy place, demanding the highest level of purity for anyone entering. The priests uphold stricter standards than ordinary Israelites. The camp itself must be maintained cleaner than the wilderness surrounding it. Each zone demands fitting levels of ritual purity for entry. The framework also recognizes that life requires continual movement between different states. People become unclean through everyday activities: birth, death, illness, intimate relations. They regain cleanness through washing, through waiting, and sometimes through offering sacrifice. This pattern of contamination and cleansing becomes woven into the fabric of life, like breathing in and breathing out. Death stands as the ultimate form of impurity within this framework. Touching a dead body produces the most severe contamination, requiring a full 7 days and specific cleansing rituals. This connection links impurity with death itself, with the forces opposing life that stand against God's creative work. The holy God of life stands in opposition to death and to decay. The purity regulations establish a protective zone around what is sacred. Because God's presence resides in the tabernacle at the camp's heart, the people must maintain fitting cleanness to safeguard that presence. Built-up impurity would compel God to withdraw, leaving Israel exposed and forsaken. The rules serve to preserve the community more than to restrict individuals. These regulations also spread holiness democratically. While priests maintain elevated standards, every Israelite takes part in the framework. Everyone must tell the difference between clean and unclean foods. Everyone goes through cycles of purity and impurity. Everyone carries responsibility for keeping the camp suitable for God's dwelling. Holiness becomes a shared undertaking. The physical focus of these regulations roots spirituality in bodily reality. Rather than scorning the body or acting as if it doesn't exist, Leviticus takes the truths of embodied life seriously. Holiness doesn't mean fleeing from the body, but rather managing it in line with divine teaching. The physical world holds significance because God chooses to make his dwelling within it. Women's blood receives particular focus in these rules. Menstruation and the bleeding of childbirth create impurity that temporarily keeps women from sacred spaces. Contemporary readers frequently find these regulations troubling, viewing them as discriminatory. Yet within the biblical understanding, blood symbolizes life, and its uncontrolled flow points to the nearness of death. The regulations acknowledge women's unique relationship to the boundary between life and death. The purity framework also offers protection for vulnerable people. A woman who has just given birth cannot be expected to meet religious duties or marital expectations. Her impurity provides her with space for healing. In the same way, those with skin conditions receive community care even while isolated. The regulations create social frameworks around biological facts. Mildew appearing in houses and clothing falls under these same rules, indicating that impurity extends beyond personal cleanliness. The spreading contamination requiring priestly action mirrors the examinations for skin conditions. The physical world itself can become corrupted, needing diagnosis and care to stop wider contamination. The thorough procedures for purification stress that purity can be recovered. No one stays permanently shut out because of natural bodily processes. The way back to cleanness stays open through specific actions. Time, water, and sometimes sacrifice restore what contamination has harmed. The framework provides hope rather than lasting exclusion. These purity regulations would deeply influence Jewish identity long after the temple's destruction ended the sacrificial framework. Dietary restrictions and family purity customs would persist. They distinguish Jews as separate, different, set apart. Even Jews who don't observe traditions often retain instinctive reactions to pork or shellfish, showing how thoroughly these categories shape cultural awareness. Jesus would push against purity boundaries, making contact with lepers, bringing the dead back to life, and pronouncing all foods clean. Yet, he operated within the framework's reasoning rather than merely rejecting it. His healing work returned people to purity. His instruction internalized the categories, concentrating on the heart's cleanness instead of outward compliance. The early church would wrestle intensely with these categories. Gentile converts followed Jewish purity regulations. The Jerusalem Council, described in Acts 15, would determine that most ritual purity demands need not apply to non-Jewish followers. Yet the core idea of separation between holy and common, fitting and unfitting, would persist in changed forms. Contemporary readers frequently dismiss purity regulations as primitive superstitions, yet they fulfill complex purposes. They foster mindfulness regarding consumption and contact. They set up boundaries that strengthen identity. They recognize the facts of embodiment while preserving space for the sacred. They instruct that approaching God demands preparation and separation. The categories of clean and unclean remind Israel that they inhabit a morally ordered universe. Not every choice holds equal weight. Not every action is fitting. Discernment holds importance. The same God who divided light from darkness summons his people to practice separation in everyday life. Through what they eat and how they diagnose, through touching and through waiting, they absorb the practices of holiness. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the holiest day. Once yearly on the 10th day of the 7th month, Israel observes the most serious fast on their calendar. The Day of Atonement stands unique among the festivals, centered not on joy, but on communal purification. As Leviticus chapter 16 reveals this yearly ritual, we observe the high priest embarking on the most perilous journey in Israelite worship, entering the very presence of God to obtain forgiveness for an entire nation. The passage begins with a harsh reminder of why this day holds significance. After the death of Aaron's 2 sons, it starts, connecting this ceremony to the disaster of Nadab and Abihu. Their unauthorized entrance into sacred territory resulted in immediate death. Now God establishes an authorized method for the high priest to enter the most holy place and live. The preparation starts before sunrise. The high priest awakens early to immerse his whole body in water. He sets aside his spectacular garments, the golden ephod, the jewel-covered breastplate, the royal turban. Instead, he puts on plain white linen, the clothing of humility. On this day, he comes before God, not in magnificence but in plainness. He must address his own sinfulness before serving for the people. A young bull stands ready as his personal sin offering. The high priest places both hands on its head, confessing his wrongdoings and those of his household. Only after being cleansed himself can he act as mediator for others. The blood of this bull will trace his path into the divine presence. 2 goats wait before the sanctuary, identical in appearance, their destinies about to separate dramatically. The high priest casts lots to decide their fates. One lot reads for the Lord, the other for Azazel. This moment of chance highlights that the choice rests with God alone. Human judgment cannot determine which route each goat will follow. The goat selected for the Lord becomes a sin offering for the people. But first, the high priest must clear the way. He gathers coals from the altar and incense prepared specially for this day. The cloud of sweet-smelling smoke will function as a barrier, shielding him from the deadly glory that resides between the cherubim on the ark's lid. Now arrives the moment of greatest danger. The high priest passes through the veil into the most holy place, that cube of absolute sanctity where God's presence dwells. The chamber lies in darkness except for the supernatural radiance of the divine presence. The smoke of incense saturates the space, forming a protective cloud between human and divine. With the blood of the bull, he carries out the first cleansing. 7 times he sprinkles toward the mercy seat, that golden covering where heaven touches earth. This blood addresses his own contamination and that of the priesthood. Even those serving at the altar need atonement. Even the mediators need mediation. He leaves to get the goat chosen for the Lord, offers it as sacrifice, and returns to the most holy place. Now he bears blood for the people's wrongdoings. Again, 7 sprinklings before the mercy seat. The gathered guilt of the nation, their rebellions, failures, and violations, receives covering through this blood application. But the purification reaches beyond the innermost sanctuary. Sin has polluted the whole sacred structure. The high priest moves to the holy place, applying blood to cleanse it. Then to the altar in the courtyard, combining the blood of bull and goat, purifying the location where daily sacrifices happen. Every sacred surface receives the purifying touch of atoning blood. Throughout these ceremonies, no other person stays in the sanctuary. The high priest operates in complete solitude, carrying the full burden of mediation between God and Israel. The other priests wait outside. The people stand at a distance. One man alone bridges the separation between holiness and sin. Now focus turns to the second goat, the one marked for Azazel. The high priest lays both hands on its head and confesses over it all the wrongdoings of Israel. This is no silent ceremony, but a spoken listing of national sins. Rebellion, violation, failure. All transfer to this living carrier of guilt. A chosen man guides this goat into the wilderness, far from human settlement. The sins of the people literally depart the camp, carried by this scapegoat into a land of no return. Some traditions describe leading the goat to a precipice and forcing it over, guaranteeing it can never wander back with its load of guilt. The high priest comes back to the sanctuary for final cleansings. He takes off the linen garments, abandoning them in the sacred place, never to be worn again. He bathes once more and puts on his regular priestly clothing. The exceptional rituals are complete. He presents the standard burnt offerings for himself and for the people. The man who guided away the scapegoat must wash his clothing and bathe before coming back into the camp. Even removing sin produces contamination. Similarly, those who burn the bodies of the bull and goat outside the camp need purification. Every dimension of sin-bearing, even its disposal, requires thoughtful handling. The passage stresses that this ceremony happens yearly on the 10th day of the 7th month. No flexibility exists in the schedule, the timing. Whether the nation feels especially sinful or comparatively righteous, the Day of Atonement comes on schedule. Sin builds up inevitably, demanding regular cleansing regardless of human awareness. This day requires everyone's participation. Every person must afflict themselves, traditionally understood as fasting. No work takes place, not even starting fires or making food. The whole nation pauses to concentrate on their relationship with God. Wealthy and poor, priest and farmer, all share equally in the day's gravity. The theology woven into these rituals proves deep. Sin is not only personal but communal. Individual violations accumulate to pollute the whole community and even the sanctuary itself. Without regular purification, the holy God would be compelled to leave his dwelling among the people. The two goats present complementary dimensions of atonement. The sacrificed goat supplies blood for purification, addressing the pollution sin produces. The scapegoat bears away the sins themselves, taking them from the community. Together, they accomplish what neither could alone. Both cleansing from sin's consequences and removal of sin itself. The yearly pattern of the ceremony acknowledges human nature. Despite best efforts, Israel will sin again. The purification of Yom Kippur is genuine, but not lasting. Next year will demand another Day of Atonement. The cycle persists as long as sinful people pursue relationship with a holy God. The danger undertaken by the high priest cannot be exaggerated. Tradition describes tying a rope around his ankle before he enters the most holy place, enabling his body to be pulled out if he dies within. Whether historically true or not, this tradition conveys the real danger of approaching unmediated divine presence. Yet the day concludes not in death, but in renewal. The sanctuary is purified. The people are forgiven. The relationship between God and Israel continues for another year. What appeared impossible, a holy God dwelling among sinful people, becomes reality through the gracious provision of atonement. The prophets would later stress that ritual without genuine repentance means nothing. Isaiah denounces those who observe Yom Kippur while mistreating workers. True fasting requires loosing chains of injustice and setting the oppressed free. The outward ritual must connect with inward change. The book of Hebrews would interpret Yom Kippur as pointing beyond itself. The repeated yearly ceremony shows its incompleteness. The high priest's need for personal purification reveals his inadequacy. The whole framework prepares for something greater. A priest needing no cleansing, a sacrifice needing no repetition, access to God requiring no special day. Yet for ancient Israel, the Day of Atonement offered deep assurance. Despite their failures, forgiveness stayed possible. Despite their pollution, purification was available. Once yearly, the record was wiped clean. The scapegoat vanished over the horizon, bearing away the burden that would otherwise overwhelm them. They could start fresh, restored in relationship with their God. The Holiness Code, Part 1. You shall be holy, for I am holy. The command resonates through the centuries with remarkable simplicity. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. With these words, Leviticus chapter 17 launches what scholars term the Holiness Code, a collection of regulations that converts ritual purity into moral living. The transformation is significant. Holiness no longer applies only to priests and sacrifices, but covers every dimension of daily life. This divine command anchors human conduct in God's own character. The summons to holiness is not random regulation, but invitation to mirror the divine nature. As God is set apart from all creation while staying involved with it, so Israel must be distinctive among nations while existing within the world. Holiness becomes less about isolation from and more about commitment to divine intentions. The section begins with rules about blood and correct slaughter. Any Israelite who slaughters an animal for food must bring it to the sanctuary entrance. This appears impractical. Must every family meal require a trip to the tabernacle? The regulation likely concerns special occasions rather than everyday meals, but its core idea stays clear. Even ordinary activities like butchering connect to sacred truths. The ban on consuming blood gets renewed emphasis with theological explanation. The life of the flesh is in the blood, God states, and I have assigned it to you on the altar to make atonement for your lives. Blood belongs to God as the very essence of life. To eat it would be to reach for divine rights, to claim possession over what God has reserved for himself. Sexual limits take up considerable space in the Holiness Code. The rules begin with a clear reminder: you shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. Israel's sexual standards must differ from neighboring cultures. The customs common among neighbors become prohibited among God's people. The bans establish concentric rings of sexual limits. Close family members are prohibited, with thorough lists eliminating any confusion. The rules protect family structure and block the power imbalances that frequently accompany incestuous relationships. In a world where powerful men might take any woman in their household, these regulations set up protective limits. The passage addresses not only who, but also when and how sexual relations take place. A woman during her monthly bleeding stays sexually unavailable. This links to the purity regulations, but also guarantees regular intervals of abstinence within marriage, preventing sex from becoming simple appetite gratification. The rhythm of approach and withdrawal reflects other sacred patterns in Israelite life. Adultery gets strong disapproval as betrayal of covenant loyalty. Marriage in Israel mirrors the exclusive relationship between God and people. To break marriage vows tears the social fabric, holding community together. The ban protects not just individual couples, but the whole network of relationships, creating stable society. The prohibition on child sacrifice appears obvious to contemporary readers, but in the ancient Near East, presenting children to Molech was practiced by Israel's neighbors. The Holiness Code completely forbids this ultimate violation of human worth. Children are gifts from God, not possessions to be discarded for supposed divine approval. Life stays sacred, especially innocent life. The rules reach into agriculture and animal breeding. Fields should not be planted with two kinds of seed. Garments should not combine wool and linen. Animals of different species should not be crossbred. These appear like random restrictions, but they strengthen the principle of separation. Creation has order, categories, fitting boundaries. Holiness honors these divine divisions. The fruit tree regulation reveals patient wisdom. For 3 years after planting, the fruit must not be eaten. The 4th year's harvest goes entirely to God. Only in the 5th year do the planters benefit from the produce. This rule teaches delayed satisfaction and recognizes God's prior claim on creation's abundance. It also practically guarantees the tree's solid establishment before heavy harvesting. Divination, magic, and consulting, the dead face prohibition. Israel must rely on God's revelation rather than manipulating spiritual powers for knowledge. The future belongs to God. Humans must live faithfully in the present rather than grasping for forbidden insight. These customs, common among neighbors, have no place among those who know the living God personally. The treatment of the body gets attention. Cutting oneself for the dead or marking the skin violates bodily wholeness. The human body carries God's image and should not be damaged by pagan customs. This does not condemn all bodily modification, but specifically those linked to idol worship or death cults. Economic fairness appears throughout the Holiness Code. Wages must be paid without delay. Holding a worker's pay overnight oppresses someone who relies on daily wages for survival. Accurate scales and measures guarantee fair commerce. The powerful must not abuse their advantage over the vulnerable. Holiness shows itself in marketplace honesty. The stranger, widow, and orphan get special protection. These groups lack the family networks, providing security in ancient society. God repeatedly identifies himself as their protector, warning against any who would abuse their weakness. The memory of slavery in Egypt should generate compassion for society's marginalized members. Age gets honor in the Holiness Code. You shall rise before the aged and show respect to the old. This simple command acknowledges the wisdom of experience and the worth of those whose productive years have ended. A holy society values people for their inherent worth, not merely their economic output. The judicial framework must reflect divine justice. Judges cannot show favoritism to wealthy or poor. Truth matters more than social position. False testimony destroys society's foundation. A holy people need honest courts where justice wins regardless of personal ties or bribes. Agricultural regulations protect the poor while teaching generosity. Farmers must not harvest to the corners of their fields or collect fallen grapes. These leftovers belong to the poor and stranger. Private property exists, but not absolute ownership. The land ultimately belongs to God, and its produce must benefit all society members. The Holiness Code repeatedly anchors its commands in divine identity and action. I am the Lord punctuates the rules, reminding Israel that these are not human customs but divine demands. I brought you out of Egypt links obedience to thankfulness. The God who freed slaves summons behavior that preserves freedom. Penalties for violations seem harsh by contemporary standards. Some sexual violations demand death. Child sacrifice requires execution. These severe outcomes reflect the fragile nature of Israel's covenant community. Surrounded by cultures practicing these very actions, Israel must keep clear boundaries or risk absorption into pagan patterns. Yet the Holiness Code aims not primarily at punishment, but at formation. These regulations shape a distinctive people whose everyday lives mirror divine character. Every meal, every business deal, every sexual encounter becomes an opportunity to display holiness. The sacred infiltrates the ordinary. The brilliance of the Holiness Code lies in its thoroughness. Rather than confining religion to ritual observance, it claims all of life for God. Work and worship, sex and sacrifice, agriculture and ethics, all fall under holiness's banner. No secular realm exists where different rules apply. This integration challenges both ancient and modern compartmentalization. The merchant cannot maintain different standards for temple and marketplace. The farmer cannot worship God while oppressing workers. Sexual conduct cannot be separated from spiritual identity. Holiness demands consistency across all life's areas. The prophets would later build on this foundation, condemning those who kept ritual purity while practicing social injustice. They did not reject the holiness code, but insisted on its full application. True holiness includes both right worship and ethical living, vertical relationship with God, and horizontal relationships with neighbors. The New Testament would universalize these principles while debating their specific uses. The summons to holiness extends to all believers. The integration of worship and ethics continues, but questions emerge about which specific rules stay binding across cultural boundaries. The principle endures, while applications adjust. For ancient Israel, the Holiness Code offered a roadmap for distinctive living. In a world where gods were local and ethics were relative, Israel proclaimed a universal God whose character should shape human conduct. Holiness meant living according to divine rather than cultural standards, creating a countercultural community whose very existence testified to their God's reality. The Holiness Code. Part 2. Love your neighbor as yourself. Chapter 19 of Leviticus stands as perhaps the most revolutionary passage in ancient literature. Here, embedded within detailed legislation, emerges a command that would resonate through millennia. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This simple statement converts law from external regulation into internal attitude, from behavioral compliance into heart change. The passage begins by addressing the whole congregation of Israel. This is not specialized instruction for priests or leaders, but universal teaching for every covenant community member. Men and women, wealthy and poor, young and old, all receive the same summons to holiness. The democratic character of this address highlights that holiness belongs to the whole people, not a spiritual elite. The opening commands anchor daily life in divine reality. Revere your mother and father, and keep my Sabbaths. Family relationships and sacred time supply the foundation for holy living. Respect for parents recognizes the human chain of transmission through which life and wisdom flow. Sabbath observance acknowledges God's authority over time itself. Instructions about sacrifice, stress, integrity, and worship. Peace offerings must be consumed within 2 days. Any remainder needs burning. This stops the sacred from becoming ordinary through spoiling. Even voluntary offerings require proper handling. Approaching God carelessly displays contempt for holiness. Right intention cannot excuse careless practice. The gleaning regulations reappear with expanded clarity. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes. The repetition highlights importance. Private property exists within communal duty. The land's abundance must benefit all. The reasoning becomes explicit. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. Economic justice flows from divine identity. The God who provides for all requires that his people share that provision. Leaving gleanings is not charity but duty, not generosity but justice. Basic ethics get divine approval. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. These commands seem self-evident, appearing in every moral code, yet here they link to covenant relationship. Stealing from a neighbor breaks relationship with God. Lies between Israelites tear the fabric of holy community. The abuse of God's name extends beyond cursing to false vows. Swearing falsely by God's name profanes that name, pulling the holy into human deception. Business agreements sealed with divine invocation must be honored. God's standing among the nations depends partly on his people's reliability. Economic oppression gets pointed condemnation. You shall not defraud your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you until morning. The powerful often delayed payment to keep leverage over workers. This custom, while perhaps legal, violates love. Those who depend on daily wages for survival must get prompt payment. The vulnerable get special protection through vivid commands. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. These bans address more than literal disabilities. The principle reaches to any exploitation of another's weakness. Taking advantage of what someone cannot see or hear violates their dignity as divine image carriers. Justice must stay impartial. You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show preference to the rich. Both temptations exist. Favoring the poor from misplaced compassion or the rich from hope of benefit. True justice sees only truth, not social rank. The scales of judgment must stay balanced. The ban on gossip seems minor compared to murder or theft. Yet it appears here among fundamental ethics. You shall not go about as a gossiper among your people. Words destroy relationships, reputations, and community trust. A holy people must guard their tongues as carefully as their actions. Then comes a deep connection. You shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. This could mean not standing idle while another faces danger, or it could ban profiting from another's misfortune. Either interpretation requires active concern for neighbor's well-being. Holiness demands engagement, not indifference. Internal attitudes get attention alongside external actions. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Hidden hatred poisons relationships even without visible display. The command continues with positive instruction. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor. Loving confrontation stops hatred from festering. Clear communication keeps community health. The climax comes with stunning simplicity. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Revenge and resentment have no place in holy community. Instead, love, active, positive, self-giving love, must characterize relationships. This love is not mere feeling but practical action. The preceding commands illustrate love's expression. Leaving grain for the poor, paying wages without delay, speaking truth, protecting the vulnerable. Love translates into concrete behaviors that enhance neighbors' flourishing. It means treating others with the same care naturally given to oneself. The phrase, as yourself, recognizes legitimate self-love as the standard for neighbor love. Humans naturally pursue their own well-being, comfort, and success. This same energy should extend to neighbors. The command does not require self-hatred but self-transcendence, expanding natural self-concern to embrace others. Mixed kinds get prohibition again. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you put on a garment made of two different materials. These commands reinforce the principle of separation, of keeping proper categories. They train Israel to identify and respect boundaries. Sexual violations within community demand serious response. A man who sleeps with a slave woman promised to another must bring a guilt offering. The woman lacking freedom to refuse carries no punishment. This acknowledges power dynamics and protects the vulnerable from bearing consequences for violations against them. New plantings demand patience. Fruit trees produce remains prohibited for 3 years, consecrated in the 4th and available in the 5th. This agricultural practice guarantees strong trees while teaching delayed satisfaction. Not everything available should be immediately consumed. Holiness includes patient waiting for right timing. Blood, whether for consumption or divination, faces absolute prohibition. You shall not eat anything with blood. You shall not practice divination or fortune-telling. Life's essence belongs to God alone. Attempts to manipulate spiritual forces through blood magic have no place among those who know God personally. Mourning customs from surrounding cultures face restriction. You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make cuts in your flesh for the dead, or tattoo any marks upon you. These bans distinguish Israelite grief from pagan death cults, while affirming bodily wholeness. The sanctuary requires reverence. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. Sacred space and time demand appropriate respect. Casual treatment of the holy shows failure to recognize God's presence. Reverence is not fear, but appropriate recognition of the divine human distinction. Parents get honor through practical support. You shall each revere his mother and father. The verb suggests not just attitude, but action, providing for aging parents, listening to their wisdom, preserving their dignity. A holy society cares for those who cared for them. The passage concludes by extending love beyond Israelite borders. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This expansion of love to include foreigners revolutionizes ancient ethics. Most cultures keep sharp distinctions between insiders and outsiders. Israel must remember their own experience as oppressed strangers. Memory of suffering should produce compassion, not repetition of oppression against new, vulnerable populations. The repeated phrase, "I am the Lord," punctuates these commands, anchoring ethics in theology. These are not human customs, but divine demands. The God who proclaims these regulations has the authority to require obedience and the character to define righteousness. Israel's conduct should mirror their God's nature. Leviticus 19 weaves together ritual and ethics, worship and justice, vertical and horizontal relationships. Love for God cannot be separated from love for neighbor. True holiness embraces both dimensions at once. The passage stands as the ethical core of the Holiness Code, showing that sanctity appears in just, compassionate community life. Jesus would later name "love your neighbor as yourself" as the second great commandment, inseparable from loving God. Rabbi Hillel would call it the essence of Torah. Paul would name it the fulfillment of the law. This simple command from Leviticus continues to challenge and inspire, calling each generation to expand the boundaries of neighbor love. The fateful penalties. Understanding the why behind severe laws. Leviticus contains passages that disturb contemporary readers. Commands to put people to death for certain violations, severe penalties that appear disproportionate, regulations that strike us as harsh, even brutal. These passages demand thoughtful consideration, not dismissal or easy defense. The death penalty shows up repeatedly in Leviticus. Blasphemy demands death. Certain sexual violations carry this penalty. Consulting mediums or spirit talkers results in execution. Child sacrifice to Molech requires the ultimate punishment. These regulations confront us with an ancient world functioning under different assumptions than our own. Understanding starts with context. Ancient Israel was not a modern nation-state with prisons, rehabilitation programs, and complex criminal justice frameworks. They were a recently formed people, lately escaped from slavery, trying to build a society in a hostile setting, surrounded by nations practicing the very things Leviticus forbids. The penalties also functioned as boundary markers. They set limits beyond which the community could not go without losing its essential character. Some violations were viewed as so destructive to covenant identity that they demanded decisive response. The penalties protected the community's survival as God's holy people. Take child sacrifice. Explicitly forbidden and severely punished. Neighboring cultures practice this. Archaeological evidence from Carthage and other locations confirms children were presented to deities like Molech. For Israel to allow this would be to become, like the nations they were summoned to be different from. The severe penalty declared, "This practice has no place among us." The ban worked as a firewall. Permit one case, and precedent is set. Allow exceptions, and the practice spreads. The death penalty for child sacrifice was not about revenge, but about stopping an abomination from taking root in the community. The harshness reflected the stakes. Sexual violations receiving capital punishment need similar contextualization. Many bans concern relationships that would disrupt family structures vital to ancient societies' functioning. Adultery threatened the clan system based on clear ancestry. Incest violated kinship boundaries, holding society together. These were not merely private moral failures, but threats to social order. The ban on same-sex relations between men appears in this context. 2 verses in Leviticus 18 and 20 forbid this, calling it an abomination. For ancient Israel, having children was vital to survival. The nation was small, constantly threatened. Non-procreative sexual activity was viewed as contrary to the mandate to be fruitful and multiply. Contemporary debates about sexual ethics engage these passages extensively. Some argue they stay binding. Others contextualize them within ancient concerns about having children, patriarchal social structures, and ritual purity frameworks no longer applicable. Still others attempt to distinguish between exploitative relationships and committed ones. The interpretive questions are complex. What stays clear is that Leviticus uses strong language and severe penalties for sexual conduct it considers outside covenant boundaries. Whether those boundaries apply universally and permanently or were culturally specific stays contested. The passage itself provides little ambiguity about its own standards, even as readers debate their ongoing relevance. Blasphemy, reviling God's name, also brings death. Words matter in Leviticus. Speech acts carry power. To curse God is not mere verbal expression, but an attack on the divine-human relationship forming Israel's foundation. A community whose survival depends on covenant with God cannot tolerate direct assault on that God's honor. The narrative in Leviticus 24 illustrates this. A man blasphemes during a dispute. The case goes to Moses. God declares the penalty: death by stoning carried out by the whole assembly. The communal nature of the execution is significant. The entire community participates, showing collective rejection of blasphemy. Consulting mediums, spirit talkers, or practicing divination get similar treatment. These customs were widespread in the ancient Near East. People regularly sought guidance from the dead, spirits, and various forms of supernatural inquiry. For Israel, this represented covenant unfaithfulness. God alone offers guidance. Seeking other sources is rebellion. The severity reflects theological stakes. If Israel consults other spiritual powers, they reject God's sufficiency. They imply God either cannot or will not guide them, so they must turn elsewhere. This strikes at the covenant's heart. The relationship depends on exclusive trust in God. The penalties also had teaching purposes. They taught the seriousness of certain violations. A community that treats blasphemy carelessly will soon lose reverence for God. A society that allows consulting the dead will gradually drift from covenant loyalty. The severe penalties declared, "These things destroy us." Some violations get cutting off rather than execution. The penalty appears frequently, but stays somewhat unclear. Does it mean execution, excommunication, divine judgment resulting in early death, or loss of descendants? Scholars debate. What is clear is that certain sins sever one from the community. Cutting off applies to violations like eating blood, certain sexual relations, and failure to observe the Day of Atonement. These offenses are serious, but perhaps not requiring immediate execution. The penalty removes the person from covenant community, either through death or permanent exclusion. The gradations of penalty matter. Not everything demands death. Some violations need only repayment, others require sacrifice, still others bring cutting off. The framework distinguishes severity, contrary to claims that all sin gets identical punishment. The context of divine presence also matters. God resides in the camp's center. Certain violations pollute the sanctuary. If pollution builds up, God will leave. The severe penalties stop pollution from reaching critical levels. They protect divine presence, without which Israel has no reason to exist. This explains penalties that seem excessive by contemporary standards. A person gathering wood on the Sabbath gets death. This appears extreme for what seems a minor violation. But Sabbath observance marked Israel as distinct. To violate it publicly was to reject covenant identity. The penalty protected what made Israel Israel. The communal nature of Israelite society also informs the penalties. Individual violations affected the whole community. One person's sin brought guilt on all. Achan's theft in Joshua results in Israel's defeat at Ai. His sin involves everyone. The community must remove the contamination to restore relationship with God. This communal understanding differs fundamentally from modern individualism. We assume people are responsible only for their own actions. Ancient Israel understood themselves as an interconnected body. One member's disease affects all. The severe penalties worked like amputation, removing diseased tissue to preserve the body's health. The penalties also assume God's direct involvement in justice. Human courts carry out sentence, but God is the ultimate judge. The penalties represent not human revenge, but divine justice implemented through human agency. This theocratic framework is foreign to modern secular legal frameworks, but essential to Leviticus's worldview. Whether these penalties were consistently applied stays uncertain. Biblical narratives suggest frequent non-enforcement. David commits adultery and murder, but is not executed. Many violations go unpunished. The regulations may have worked more as ideal standards than consistently enforced statutes. This possibility does not reduce their significance. They set boundaries, proclaim values, and shape communal conscience even when not rigidly enforced. The mere existence of the regulation affects conduct. People know the standard even when enforcement is inconsistent. The prophets later critique Israel's legal failures. They condemn corruption, letting the powerful escape justice while the vulnerable suffer. The regulations were meant to apply equally, but human implementation often twisted them. This does not invalidate the regulations, but shows the gap between ideal and reality. Jesus' interaction with the woman caught in adultery engages these regulations. The Pharisees cite Mosaic command to stone her. Jesus responds, "Let the one without sin cast the first stone." They leave. Jesus does not condemn her, but tells her to sin no more. This episode raises questions about the regulation's application and mercy's role. Christian interpretation generally views these penalties as part of the Old Covenant, superseded by Christ. The New Testament declares that Christ carried the curse of the law. Believers are not under law but grace. The death penalty provisions no longer bind Christians who live under a new covenant with different standards. Yet the underlying concerns persist. Sexual ethics matter, reverence for God matters, community boundaries matter. Christians debate which Levitical standards stay binding and how they translate to new covenant life. The specific penalties may not apply, but the values they protected still resonate. Jewish tradition developed elaborate safeguards, making capital punishment nearly impossible to implement. Rabbinic law required multiple witnesses, specific warnings, and unanimous agreement among judges. A Sanhedrin that executed one person in 70 years was called destructive. The trajectory was toward limiting, not expanding, capital punishment. This development suggests that even within Jewish tradition, these regulations were understood as requiring careful interpretation rather than mechanical application. The severity of the written regulation was softened by interpretive tradition, emphasizing life, mercy, and extreme caution in applying irreversible penalties. Contemporary readers face these passages with discomfort. Our values emphasize human rights, rehabilitation, and proportional punishment. Death for blasphemy or Sabbath violation seems barbaric. We struggle to reconcile these regulations with claims that the Bible is a moral guide. Several approaches exist. Some maintain the regulations reflected God's perfect will for ancient Israel in their specific context, but were not meant as universal, timeless standards. Others see them as accommodations to ancient Near Eastern culture, divine concessions to human hardness of heart. Still others argue they stay binding in principle, if not specific application. What seems clear is that Leviticus takes certain violations with utmost seriousness. The community's survival, its covenant relationship with God, and its distinct identity were always at stake. The regulations were not random cruelty, but boundary maintenance for a fragile nation in a hostile world. The penalties also reflect the cost of holiness. To be God's people set apart demands vigilance. It requires clear boundaries and decisive action against threats to covenant identity. The contemporary church's struggle with maintaining distinctiveness while showing mercy echoes Israel's ancient challenge. Leviticus challenges both those who dismiss biblical law as irrelevant and those who apply it rigidly without nuance. The regulations require careful reading, historical understanding, and theological interpretation. They are neither self-evidently applicable nor easily dismissed. The severe penalties ultimately point beyond themselves. They show sin's seriousness, relationships' fragility, and holiness's demands. They reveal a God who takes covenant faithfulness seriously and expects the same from his people. They establish that some violations are truly destructive, not merely unfortunate. Whether the specific penalties stay binding or were context-specific, the values they protected persist. Reverence for God, sexual integrity, community boundaries, justice, holiness. These concerns transcend ancient Israel. How they are protected and enforced may change, but their importance endures. The fateful penalties of Leviticus disturb us. Perhaps they should. They prevent comfortable domestication of God. They resist reducing covenant to pleasant religious observance. They insist that relationship with the holy God involves real stakes. They remind us that holiness is costly, boundaries matter, and some things truly do threaten communal survival. These regulations, severe and troubling as they are, form part of Scripture's witness. They challenge us to wrestle with difficult passages rather than ignore them. They force questions about justice, mercy, community, and the nature of holiness. They refuse easy answers. And perhaps in that refusal they still serve their ancient purpose, making us think deeply about what it means to be God's people. The framework aligns with biblical text and mirrors the authentic arrangement found in Leviticus. I observe that sections 11 through 14 address Leviticus chapters 23 through 27, which constitute canonical scripture. Sections 15 through 20 transition into historical implementation and the history of how these texts were received, interpretive and analytical in nature, with no chronological errors apparent in the structure. Geographic mentions will employ ancient Near Eastern locations, Sinai, Canaan, and similar territories. The movement from scriptural text toward practical application proves sound. Now, turning to the narrative itself, priests, sacred festivals, and time, the sanctification of the calendar. At Sinai's foundation, the tabernacle now stands erected and complete. The system of sacrifice functions as designed. Between heaven and earth, priests serve as mediators. Still, one element has gone unaddressed: time in its essence. Chapter 23 of Leviticus presents a revolutionary idea. Just as space can be sanctified, so too can time become holy. Not all moments hold equivalent significance. Specific days carry sacred weight, separated by divine command from the regular progression of daily existence. The chapter begins with a pronouncement. These represent the appointed times, the Lord's festivals. In Hebrew, the term is moed, signifying appointed meeting. These days operate as scheduled encounters between the divine and his people, integrated into the calendar like golden threads woven through ordinary fabric. The initial appointment involves the Sabbath. Work stops completely every seventh day. This rhythm continues weekly, an endless pulse of rest combined with remembrance. The Sabbath exists separately from festivals tied to seasons. It connects to creation itself, resonating back to Genesis when the divine rested on day 7. Every Sabbath recreates that original pause, that interval between creating and simply existing. Spring ushers in Passover, observed on day 14 of the opening month. This festival commemorates the liberation night when divine judgment bypassed doorways, bearing the proper mark throughout Egypt. Families come together. A lamb undergoes preparation. Unleavened bread gets consumed hastily, just as the ancestors consumed it before their departure. Through ritual reenactment, memory transforms into present experience. Following Passover, immediately arrives the Feast of Unleavened Bread, continuing 7 days. Yeast touches no food whatsoever. The lack of leavening agent symbolizes the rushed exit from slavery. Yet, it signifies something deeper still: the elimination of corruption, the removal of ancient contamination. 7 full days, consuming bread with no rising agent. Bread representing affliction becomes bread signifying freedom. Within this week, an additional ceremony takes place. Before the Lord, the priest waves a sheaf containing the initial grain. This offering, termed the first fruits, recognizes that the harvest belongs to the divine before people sample even one kernel. The land's yield flows from divine blessing. The opening portion returns to its origin. 50 days following this wave offering, another festival arrives, the Feast of Weeks, known later as Pentecost. 7 weeks elapse, 7 times 7 days plus an additional one. The 50th day signals the wheat harvest's completion. Before the Lord, 2 loaves baked containing yeast get waved. Unlike springtime's unleavened bread, these loaves include leaven, representing the standard bread of established agricultural existence. The yeast prohibition is lifted. Regular life, now sanctified, resumes. These spring and early summer observances connect Israel's calendar to agricultural cycles. Barley harvesting commences at Passover. Wheat harvesting concludes at Weeks. The festivals convert farming into acts of worship, transforming labor itself into covenant faithfulness. Autumn delivers a concentration of sacred days. The 7th month, perpetually significant, just as the 7th day holds sacred status, encompasses 3 substantial observances. Day 1 of the 7th month gets marked by trumpet sounds. The Feast of Trumpets makes an announcement. Ram's horns resound throughout the camp. The sound itself constitutes the observance, capturing attention, requiring awareness. What follows these blasts carries considerable weight. 10 days afterward arrives the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, representing the most serious day across Israel's entire year. Into the most holy place, the high priest enters. Blood provides atonement for sanctuary, priesthood, and people. Into wilderness exile, the scapegoat transports sin. The nation's record gets wiped completely clean. This day stands singular in its gravity and significance. 5 days past atonement, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. The Feast of Tabernacles commences, lasting 7 days, with an 8th day designated for sacred assembly. Also named booths or shelters, this festival mandates something distinctive. Israelites must vacate their homes and inhabit temporary structures constructed from branches and leaves. For 1 complete week, permanence surrenders to fragility. The symbolism runs profoundly deep. These booths recall the wilderness years, when Israel inhabited tents, entirely dependent upon divine provision. No stored grain sustained their existence. Manna descended each morning. From rock, water flowed. The temporary shelters remind every generation that security originates not from stone houses or fortified cities, but from divine faithfulness. Tabernacles additionally celebrates the final harvest. Grapes, olives, late fruits. The agricultural year reaches completion, storage facilities fill. Yet at this precise moment of maximum abundance, Israel abandons solid dwellings to sit beneath leafy canopies. Prosperity must never breed forgetfulness. Memory of dependence must continue through times of plenty. The festival calendar establishes a sanctified year. Not one lengthy, undifferentiated expanse of days, but rather a rhythm, alternating ordinary with extraordinary, work with rest, remembrance with anticipation. The festivals punctuate time like verses compose a song, providing shape and significance to the progression of seasons. These appointed times additionally construct communal identity. Every family takes part. Both rich and poor cease work on the Sabbath. Everyone consumes unleavened bread throughout Passover week. All inhabit booths during tabernacles. Shared observance generates shared experience, binding individuals into one unified people. The festivals also sanctify the land in its essence. The offerings comprise the land's produce: grain, wine, oil, livestock. The people cannot observe these feasts in Egypt, in Babylon, or on any foreign territory. The festivals belong to Canaan, to the promised inheritance. Celebrating them declares, "This land belongs to us, because the divine granted it." The calendar anchors Israel geographically as profoundly as spiritually. Beyond practicality, the festivals teach theology through lived experience. Passover instructs that the divine liberates. The Day of Atonement instructs that sin carries weight but isn't final. Tabernacles instructs that the divine provides. Week following week, month following month, the calendar catechizes. The festivals additionally look forward. They anticipate something extending beyond themselves. The Sabbath rest hints toward an ultimate rest. The atonement of Yom Kippur suggests a final reconciliation. The booths of tabernacles point toward a permanent dwelling of the divine with humanity. The calendar contains its own eschatology, its own vision regarding completion. Leviticus 23 transforms time from abstract measurement into theological category. Minutes and hours stop being neutral. They become opportunities for holiness, for meeting, for remembrance. The calendar in itself becomes worship's form. This sanctification of time accomplishes something profound. It prevents confining the sacred to a single location. The tabernacle occupies one space, yet Sabbaths occur everywhere simultaneously. Festivals happen wherever Israel assembles. Holiness spreads across time equally with space, permeating existence from multiple dimensions. The appointed times additionally regulate religious enthusiasm. Worship doesn't depend on spontaneous feeling or individual inspiration. It follows structure, a pattern. The divine determines when holy convocations take place. This removes the burden of generating spiritual experience through human effort. The calendar provides it reliably, repeatedly, permanently. For people so recently enslaved, this rhythm of festivals offers something revolutionary: control over their own time. Slaves possess no calendar. Their days belong to masters. Free people mark time according to their own sacred observances. The festivals proclaim, "Your time belongs to you because it belongs first to the divine, not to Pharaoh." The calendar additionally creates anticipation. Following Passover, one counts toward the Feast of Weeks. Following trumpets, one prepares for the Day of Atonement. The year advances with purpose, perpetually approaching another encounter, another appointed meeting. Time acquires direction and meaning. These festivals persist. Centuries afterward, Jewish communities worldwide continue observing Passover, Yom Kippur, tabernacles. The calendar outlasted the tabernacle itself, survived the temple's destruction, persisted through exile and dispersion. When sacred space vanished, sacred time remained, both portable and indestructible. Christianity would subsequently reinterpret these festivals through Christ's lens. Passover transforms into Easter. Pentecost marks the Spirit's outpouring. The Day of Atonement foreshadows Calvary. Still, the underlying principle continues. Time itself can become holy, set apart, made sacred through divine appointment and human observance. In Leviticus 23, the divine hands Israel a calendar. Simple as this sounds, it revolutionizes existence. No longer must they wander through undifferentiated days, working until exhaustion claims them, forgetting their story, losing their identity. The festivals provide shape to the year, meaning to the months, purpose to the weeks. Time becomes not an enemy requiring flight or a resource demanding exploitation, but a gift requiring sanctification, one appointed meeting at a time. The Sabbath and Jubilee years, a radical economic vision. Leviticus chapter 25 extends sacred time's principle beyond days and weeks into years and decades. What applies to day 7 now applies to year 7. The Sabbath rhythm expands, and with it emerges a vision challenging economic life's very foundations. The sabbatical year initiates the pattern. 6 years, the land undergoes working, fields receive plowing, sowing, and harvesting, vineyards receive pruning and tending, olive groves receive cultivation. Normal agricultural life proceeds. Then arrives the 7th year. In that year, all farming ceases. No plowing, no sowing, no pruning. The land rests, observing its own Sabbath. Whatever grows independently, volunteer grain, unpruned vines, untended fruit, belongs equally to everyone. Landowner and servant, citizen and sojourner, all consume from identical uncultivated produce. For 12 months, property distinctions become blurred. The command appears economically irrational. Ancient Near Eastern agriculture operated at subsistence level. Most families produced barely sufficient amounts to survive year to year. Deliberate rest for an entire year risked famine. Yet the divine commands it and promises something remarkable. The 6th year will produce enough for 3 years, the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th, until the next harvest arrives. This provision requires faith. It demands trust that abundance originates from obedience, not merely from endless labor. The sabbatical year breaks anxiety's tyranny, the fear that only constant striving prevents disaster. 1 year in 7, Israel must remember the land's fruitfulness flows from blessing, not just from sweat. The sabbatical year additionally includes debt release. Loans made between Israelites must receive forgiveness. Outstanding balances get cancelled. The Hebrew word for this release is shmita, meaning to drop or let fall. Every 7 years, the financial slate wipes clean. This law contains profound implications. It prevents permanently accumulating unpayable debt. A poor harvest or unexpected calamity might force a family into debt, yet that debt cannot persist beyond 7 years. Economic failure cannot become generational. The cycle undergoes reset. Creditors face temptation as the sabbatical year approaches. Why extend money in year 6 when it must receive forgiveness in year 7? Leviticus anticipates this and commands, "Do not harden your heart or shut your hand toward your poor brother. Lend freely, even as the release year nears." Generosity must not calculate return on investment. The 7th year additionally brings freedom for Hebrew servants. A person might sell themselves into service for paying debt. They work for their creditor, laboring to discharge the obligation. Yet in the 7th year, they depart free, released from servitude with gifts to begin anew. This cycle of 7 years establishes a rhythm: work, rest, release, renewal. Yet Leviticus pushes further. 7 times 7 years pass, 49 years. Then arrives the 50th, the year of Jubilee, when the economic reset reaches its fullest expression. The Jubilee year commences on the Day of Atonement. The ram's horn sounds across the land. The Hebrew word for ram's horn is yovel, providing the year its name. The trumpet blast announces liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. In the Jubilee year, all agricultural land returns to its original family inheritance. Regardless of how many times it has undergone sale, regardless of current ownership, the land reverts to the clan that initially received it when Canaan underwent division. This law prevents permanent loss of ancestral property. Land could undergo buying and selling between jubilees, yet the sale was never truly permanent. What actually underwent sale was a certain number of harvests until the next jubilee. The price reflected how many years remained. A field sold just after Jubilee cost more than one sold just before the next Jubilee. The land itself always remained bound to its original family inheritance. This system makes land commodification impossible. Land cannot become mere property bought up by the wealthy and denied to the poor. Every 50 years, the distribution returns to its initial pattern. Concentrated ownership cannot develop. Economic inequality possesses a built-in corrective. The Jubilee additionally brings additional servant releases beyond the sabbatical year provisions. Any Hebrew still in service departs free in the Jubilee, regardless of when their service commenced. They return to their ancestral land, to their family, to their proper place in the social order. These laws contain an underlying theology. The land belongs to the divine. The people are tenants, stewards, not ultimate owners. The divine declares in Leviticus 25, "The land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me." No one possesses absolute property rights because the divine holds the ultimate title deed. This perspective transforms economics from a neutral science into a theological category. How people manage resources, how they treat debtors, how they use the land, all become matters of covenant faithfulness. Economics cannot be separated from worship. The sabbatical and jubilee years additionally recognize human dignity. They acknowledge that people make mistakes, suffer misfortunes, experience setbacks. These laws prevent such setbacks from becoming permanent. A person who loses their land or falls into debt receives a fresh start. The system contains mercy, not only justice. The laws additionally protect the vulnerable. Without the sabbatical release, debt would crush the poor. Without Jubilee, landlessness would perpetuate. The wealthy would gradually absorb all resources. These provisions prevent such concentration, maintaining a more equitable distribution across generations. Beyond economics, these laws teach dependence on the divine. Observing sabbatical and jubilee years requires collective trust. The entire nation must believe that the divine will provide during the fallow year, that the economy will survive debt releases, that returning land to original owners will not cause chaos. This shared faith builds national character. Whether ancient Israel ever fully observed these laws remains uncertain. The historical records suggest frequent failures. Prophets condemn violations. Chronicles implies sabbatical years underwent neglect for centuries, accumulating as debt that the Babylonian exile paid off. The laws proved easier to write than to follow. Yet, their existence in the text matters. They established an ideal, a vision of what covenant economics should look like. They provided a standard against which actual practice could undergo measurement and be found wanting. The laws functioned as perpetual critique of systems that oppressed the poor or concentrated wealth. Later, Jewish tradition continued engaging these texts. Rabbinic literature debated how to apply sabbatical laws when Israel lived under foreign rule. Post-biblical Judaism developed modifications while attempting to preserve the principles. The laws remained live questions, not dead letters. The early Christian community in Acts briefly attempted something similar, selling possessions, holding all things in common, ensuring no one lacked. Whether they consciously imitated Jubilee or simply responded to Jesus' teachings, the impulse toward economic sharing resonated with Levitical principles. Modern social justice movements often reference Jubilee. Debt forgiveness campaigns, land reform efforts, and calls for economic redistribution echo these ancient laws. The vision of periodic reset, of preventing permanent inequality, continues inspiring those who seek a more just society. The sabbatical and Jubilee laws reveal something crucial about Leviticus. The book is not merely concerned with ritual purity or sacrificial procedure. It envisions a comprehensive holiness that encompasses economic life, property, relationships, and social structure. Holiness transforms not just worship, but also commerce. These laws additionally demonstrate divine concern for the oppressed. The divine sides with debtors, with servants, with those who have lost their land. The powerful must release their hold. The accumulation of wealth must halt. The system must reset. This preferential option for the vulnerable runs throughout Scripture, yet nowhere more concretely than in Leviticus 25. The sabbatical and Jubilee years stand as perhaps the most radical economic vision in ancient literature. No other ancient Near Eastern legal code contains anything comparable. These laws imagine an economy oriented not toward maximum productivity or wealth accumulation, but toward rest, release, and restoration. They propose that society should be structured to prevent permanent poverty and maintain human dignity across generations. Whether ancient Israel achieved this vision or whether it remains an unrealized ideal, the laws themselves endure. They continue asking uncomfortable questions. Who truly owns the land? What limits should constrain economic activity? How should society treat the indebted and dispossessed? Can economic systems incorporate mercy without collapsing? The answers Leviticus provides remain as challenging today as they were 33 centuries ago. Blessings and curses, the two pathways. Leviticus chapter 26 brings the legal material to a conclusion with a stark, almost brutal clarity. After establishing the sacrificial system, purity laws, ethical commands, and festival calendar, the text now addresses the inevitable question: what happens if Israel obeys? What happens if they disobey? The chapter functions as a covenant epilogue, a formal closing to the treaty between the divine and Israel. Ancient Near Eastern treaties typically ended with blessings for compliance and curses for violation. Leviticus follows this pattern, yet invests it with unique theological depth. The chapter begins with reminders: make no idols, keep the Sabbaths, reverence the sanctuary. These commands summarize the core of what precedes. Then arrives the conditional. If you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, the blessings that follow are concrete, tangible, agricultural. Rain will arrive in its season, the land will yield crops, trees will bear fruit, threshing will last until grape harvest, and grape harvest until sowing time. Abundance will be so great that old grain must undergo clearing to make room for new. Scarcity will transform into memory. Beyond agriculture, the divine promises peace. No sword will pass through the land, wild animals will be removed, sleep will come without fear. 5 Israelites will chase 100 enemies. 100 will chase 10,000. Military might will be disproportionate to numbers because the divine will fight for them. The blessings additionally include fruitfulness. The people will multiply, their numbers will increase. Population growth becomes a sign of divine favor, fulfilling the ancient promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as stars. The divine promises his presence. He will place his dwelling among them. His soul will not abhor them. He will walk among them, be their God, and they will be his people. This promise echoes Eden, where the divine walked in the garden. The goal is restored intimacy, healed relationship, unmediated communion. Then the tone shifts. The word if reappears, yet now attached to disobedience. If you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, if you spurn my statutes and abhor my rules. What follows is not symmetrical. The curses vastly outnumber the blessings. They increase in intensity through 5 escalating stages, each introduced by, "If you still will not listen to me." The progression suggests patience exhausted by repeated refusal, mercy giving way to judgment only after extended rebellion. The first wave of consequences brings disease and fever. Crops fail. Enemies devour what little grows. Those who hate Israel rule over them. They will flee when no one pursues, haunted by guilt and fear, even in the absence of actual threat. If rebellion continues, the divine promises to break the pride of their power. The sky becomes iron, the earth bronze. Rain stops. Strength is spent in vain. The land yields nothing. Trees bear no fruit. Starvation creeps closer. The third escalation brings wild animals. They will bereave Israel of children, destroy livestock, make them few in number. Roads will become desolate because travel becomes too dangerous. Nature itself turns hostile. The fourth stage is plague and siege. Bread becomes scarce. Women bake in a single oven what would normally require many. Food undergoes rationing by weight. Hunger intensifies. During siege, desperation drives people to unthinkable acts, consuming their own children's flesh. The text does not flinch from this horror. The fifth and final wave describes complete devastation. Cities become ruins. Sanctuaries are laid waste. The land is so desolate that even enemies who occupy it are appalled. The people are scattered among nations, pursued by the sword with no rest, no security, living in perpetual terror. A rustling leaf becomes a threat. Exhaustion and fear will consume them in foreign lands. Yet even this destruction serves a purpose. The land, finally emptied of its inhabitants, will enjoy its Sabbaths. During the desolation, the land will rest, making up for all the sabbatical years that underwent ignoring when the people dwelt in it. The earth itself receives justice. The curses escalate not because the divine delights in punishment, but because rebellion is progressive. Sin compounds. Each act of disobedience makes the next easier. The curses mirror this downward spiral, showing where persistent rebellion inevitably leads. Embedded in the curses is historical foreshadowing. Readers familiar with Israel's later history hear echoes. The Assyrian conquest, the Babylonian exile, the destruction of Jerusalem. The curses function both as warning and as explanation. When disaster comes, it will not be random. It will be the working out of covenant violation. Yet chapter 26 does not end with exile and terror. The final section describes repentance and restoration. Even in foreign lands, if the people confess their iniquity and their ancestors' iniquity, if they humble their uncircumcised hearts and make amends for their sin, the divine will remember his covenant. The word remember here does not mean recalling something forgotten. The divine does not forget. To remember the covenant means to act on it, to implement it, to bring its promises into reality. The divine will remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He will remember the land. The promise of restoration contains profound theology. Even after the worst violations, even after triggering the most severe curses, the covenant is not void. The divine will not completely reject or destroy them, even in the land of their enemies. Why? For the covenant's sake. The divine bound himself to Abraham, and that binding holds regardless of the descendants' faithfulness. This section additionally promises that the divine will remember the first covenant, the Exodus generation whom he brought out of Egypt in the sight of the nations to be their God. The memory of liberation becomes the ground for future restoration. What the divine started, he will complete. Chapter 26 presents a binary vision, 2 paths, 2 futures. One leads through obedience to blessing, presence, peace, and abundance. The other leads through rebellion to curse, exile, terror, and devastation. The choice belongs to Israel. The divine does not predetermine the outcome, but establishes the consequences. This structure transforms the legal material that preceded it from abstract commands into existential choices. Every law about sacrifice, purity, ethics, or festivals now carries weight. Observance or violation shapes national destiny. The stakes could not be higher. The chapter additionally functions as theodicy in advance. It explains why bad things might happen to the divine's people. Not because the divine is weak or absent, but because the covenant includes conditions. Disaster is not divine failure, but covenant enforcement. The explanation is provided before the events occur. For ancient readers facing exile or occupation, chapter 26 offers both indictment and hope. It convicts them of covenant breaking, yet also promises that the divine has not finished with them. The relationship can undergo restoration. Return is possible. The curses are not final. The two pathways presented in Leviticus 26 echo throughout Scripture. Deuteronomy 30 presents a similar choice between life and death, blessing and curse. Joshua 24 challenges Israel to choose whom they will serve. The prophets constantly call the people back to this fundamental decision. In Christian reading, the blessings and curses take on additional layers. Christ is seen as bearing the curse of the law, absorbing its full weight on the cross. Believers enter into blessing not through their own covenant faithfulness, but through His. The binary pathway is transcended, yet somehow fulfilled in His death and rising. Yet even in Christian interpretation, the principle persists. Actions have consequences. Choices matter. The relationship with the divine is not abstract spirituality, but lived reality with tangible outcomes. Obedience shapes life. Rebellion destroys it. Leviticus 26 refuses cheap grace and easy assurance. It insists that the covenant makes demands, that the divine takes sin seriously, that there are real consequences for sustained rebellion. Yet it also refuses ultimate despair, promising restoration even after the worst violations. The God of Leviticus is both just and merciful, holding judgment and grace in tension. The chapter stands as a fitting conclusion to the Holiness Code. After detailing what holiness requires, it now reveals what holiness produces: life, peace, presence, and what its rejection brings: death, terror, exile. The two pathways stretch before the reader. The choice echoes across centuries. Which way will you walk? Vows and tithes. The Code's practical conclusion. After the dramatic covenant epilogue of chapter 26, with its blessings and curses, Leviticus continues with one final chapter. At first glance, chapter 27 appears anticlimactic, almost mundane. It addresses vows, dedications, and valuations. Why place these regulations here after what seemed like a fitting conclusion? The answer lies in understanding vows as the intersection of personal devotion and covenant obligation. Chapter 27 shows how individual commitment works within the covenant framework already established. The grand sweep of national obedience and disobedience now focuses down to personal, voluntary acts of dedication. The chapter begins with a specific situation. When someone makes a special vow to the Lord involving the valuation of persons. This refers to instances where someone dedicates a person, often themselves or a family member, to divine service, then wishes to redeem that dedication with money. The text provides a detailed valuation scale. Males aged 20 to 60 are valued at 50 shekels, females in the same age range 30 shekels. Children and elderly persons have lower valuations. The poorest can bring whatever they can afford, presented to the priest, who will assess their ability to pay. These valuations are not statements about human worth. They reflect labor capacity and earning potential within an ancient agricultural economy. The amounts represent what that person's service would contribute to the sanctuary if they actually served there, rather than being redeemed with payment. The practice described here solves a practical problem. Someone in distress might vow to dedicate their child to temple service if the divine delivers them from danger. The crisis passes. The vow remains binding, yet the sanctuary does not need or want impressed labor. The valuation system provides a way to fulfill the vow through financial equivalent. The next section addresses animals vowed to the divine. If someone vows a clean animal suitable for sacrifice, it must be given. It becomes holy. No substitution is allowed. Attempting to exchange it makes both the original and substitute holy. Both belong to the divine. This prevents someone from vowing their best animal, then substituting an inferior one. Unclean animals, those unsuitable for sacrifice like donkeys, can undergo redemption. The priest assesses the value. The person adds 1/5 to that value and pays it. If they refuse to redeem it, the animal undergoes sale at the assessed price, and the proceeds go to the sanctuary. Houses and fields can also undergo dedication. If someone dedicates their house, the priest values it. To redeem it, the person pays the valuation plus 20%. If a field undergoes dedication, its value is calculated based on how much seed it requires. A homer of barley seed equals 50 shekels. If the field undergoes dedication right after Jubilee, full value is paid. If dedicated closer to the next Jubilee, the value undergoes prorating based on remaining years. A crucial restriction applies to land. Only inherited property can undergo dedication and redemption. Purchased land not originally part of the family inheritance, returns to its original owner at Jubilee if dedicated. This prevents manipulation of the Jubilee system through dedicating purchased land to the sanctuary. Another category is introduced, the devoted thing, or sharem in Hebrew. This represents the most extreme level of dedication. When something is devoted to destruction or placed under the ban, it cannot undergo redemption. It belongs irrevocably to the divine. This applies to things captured in holy war or items so dedicated by their owner. Humans placed under cherem cannot be ransomed. They must be put to death. This refers not to murder, but to specific contexts of divine judgment executed through Israel, such as Canaanite cities placed under the ban, or Israelites guilty of certain covenant violations. The practice is harsh, rooted in ancient Near Eastern holy war concepts. The chapter then addresses tithes. 1/10 of the land's produce, grain, fruit, and every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod belongs to the divine. The tithe is holy to the Lord. This principle appears earlier in Leviticus and extends back to Genesis, where Abraham gives Melchizedek 1/10. Grain and fruit tithes can undergo redemption by paying their value plus 20%. Animal tithes cannot undergo redemption or substitution. The 10th animal, whether good or bad, once it passes under the counting rod, belongs to the divine. This prevents selective tithing, keeping the best for oneself while dedicating inferior animals. Chapter 27 concludes Leviticus with a formulaic statement. These are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. This closing frames everything that preceded, from sacrifices to purity laws to ethics to festivals, as unified divine instruction given at a specific time and place. The placement of this chapter serves several purposes. After presenting the covenant's grand scope and cosmic stakes, it grounds holiness in practical details. Vows happen in real life. People dedicate property. Tithes must undergo calculation. The holy life includes mundane financial decisions. The chapter additionally addresses the relationship between voluntary devotion and required obedience. Vows are optional. No one must vow, yet once made, vows become binding. The chapter provides structures for fulfilling voluntary commitments, showing that even spontaneous devotion operates within covenant order. The valuations and regulations prevent exploitation. Without clear guidelines, the unscrupulous could make showy vows with no intention of fulfilling them. The regulations make vows serious, costly, and enforceable. This protects worship's integrity and prevents manipulating devotion for personal gain. The 20% penalty for redemption serves multiple purposes. It discourages impulsive vows later regretted. It compensates the sanctuary for the administrative burden of handling valuations and redemptions. It ensures that fulfilling a vow through redemption still costs something, maintaining the sacrificial nature of the act. The tithe regulations emphasize that resources belong primarily to the divine. The land produces because the divine blesses it. Giving back a tenth acknowledges this. The tithe is not charity but recognition of divine ownership. Humans are stewards managing divine property. The prohibition on substituting tithed animals prevents gaming the system. Without this rule, someone could designate their worst animals as the tithe, then substitute them for even inferior animals, keeping the best for themselves. The rule makes tithing honest. Chapter 27 additionally shows the flexibility within Levitical law. Multiple options exist for fulfilling vows, actual dedication or redemption with payment. The valuation scales account for poverty. The system balances firmness, vows are binding, with mercy, reasonable options for fulfillment. For later Judaism, these regulations provided essential guidance as the temple system developed. Questions arose. Can inherited fields undergo dedication? How are valuations determined? What about ambiguous situations? Chapter 27 supplied answers, preventing disputes and maintaining order. Christian interpretation saw in vows and tithes principles of stewardship and whole life dedication. Paul writes of presenting bodies as living sacrifices. The language echoes Levitical dedication. Resources, time, and selves are offered to the divine. Though the specific regulations of valuations no longer bind, the underlying principle persists. Everything belongs to the divine. The chapter's position at Leviticus's end suggests that proper understanding of holiness leads to generous dedication. After learning about sacrifice, purity, ethics, and festivals, the natural response is voluntary offering beyond what is required. The holy life overflows into open-handed devotion, yet the regulations also temper enthusiasm with order. Even generous impulses must operate within covenant structures. Devotion is not mere feeling, but concrete action with real cost. The chapter prevents spiritual romanticism, grounding commitment in practical, verifiable acts. Leviticus concludes, not with soaring rhetoric or apocalyptic visions, but with detailed instructions about valuations and tithes. This ending is fitting. The book has always been concerned with how holiness works in practice, how covenant faithfulness shapes everyday decisions. Chapter 27 continues this focus to the very last verse. The commandments given at Sinai encompass everything: worship and ethics, ritual and economics, national festivals and personal vows. All of life falls under divine covenant. Holiness is not compartmentalized spirituality, but total existence oriented toward the divine. Even calculating redemption values becomes an act of covenant faithfulness. Even selecting animals for tithes becomes worship. The sacred encompasses all. Leviticus in the desert, how it shaped a wandering nation. The laws of Leviticus were not given to a settled people dwelling in cities with temple infrastructure. They were proclaimed to refugees living in tents, camped at the base of a desert mountain. Understanding how these laws functioned during the wilderness years reveals their deeper purpose. The wilderness generation faced unique challenges. They were neither slaves in Egypt nor landowners in Canaan. They existed in transition between liberation and inheritance. Their identity was unstable. Former slaves do not automatically become a cohesive nation simply by crossing a sea. Leviticus provided this wandering people with structure. The tabernacle stood at the camp center, The tribes arranged around it in prescribed order. Priests and Levites formed the innermost ring. Each family knew its place. The camp itself became a sacred diagram, a portable sanctuary creating order in the chaos of nomadic existence. The daily sacrificial rhythm established routine. Morning and evening offerings, Sabbath observances, new moon celebrations. These regular rituals marked time, giving shape to what could have been undifferentiated days of desert wandering. Time became sacred, measured by liturgy rather than labor. The purity laws created constant awareness. Every meal required attention to clean and unclean animals. Every bodily discharge necessitated ritual response. Childbirth, skin diseases, mildew in tents, all demanded engagement with the Levitical system. The laws made holiness tangible, impossible to ignore or compartmentalize. This constant engagement shaped identity. Israelites could not eat what Egyptians ate. They could not approach the sacred as other nations did. They could not organize society along typical ancient Near Eastern lines. Every difference reinforced uniqueness. The laws built walls, not physical barriers, but cultural and religious boundaries that separated Israel from surrounding peoples. The boundary maintenance mattered especially in the desert. Israel was not isolated. They encountered Moabites, Midianites, Amalekites, and others. Without clear identity markers, assimilation was a constant threat. Mixed marriages, adopted practices, borrowed gods, all could dilute Israelite distinctiveness. The Levitical laws resisted this erosion. The sacrificial system additionally addressed psychological needs. Former slaves carried trauma. The Israelites experienced brutality in Egypt. They witnessed the plagues. They walked through the sea. They saw Pharaoh's army destroyed. Such experiences leave deep marks. The sacrifices provided a ritual means of processing guilt, fear, and alienation. Placing hands on the animal transferred sin symbolically. Watching the sacrifice acknowledged wrongdoing. Receiving forgiveness restored relationship. The system offered psychological relief through physical ritual. The Day of Atonement in particular addressed collective guilt, not individual sins but national transgressions. The scapegoat carried away the accumulated weight of communal failure. For a people still learning to function as a nation, this annual reset prevented the accumulation of unaddressed corporate sin. The festivals created shared memory. Passover recalled Egyptian deliverance. Unleavened bread commemorated hasty departure. These observances were not abstract theology, but experiential remembering. Eating bitter herbs, telling the Exodus story, waving first fruits, all embedded memory in bodily practice. For children born in the wilderness, these rituals transmitted identity. They had not experienced Egyptian slavery. Their parents' stories could seem distant, yet participating in Passover made them part of the narrative. They too ate the bread of affliction. They too celebrated deliverance. The rituals made the past present. The holiness laws additionally created practical order. Regulations about bodily discharges and skin diseases prevented contagion in crowded camps. Dietary restrictions may have provided health benefits in a pre-refrigeration desert environment. The laws functioned simultaneously as religious instruction and practical hygiene. The economic regulations, though designed for settled agricultural life, still applied even in the wilderness. People owed debts. Disputes over property arose. The ethical commands about honesty, justice, and treating the vulnerable applied equally to desert encampments and future cities. The moral vision shaped relationships immediately, not just eventually. The priesthood provided leadership beyond worship. Priests adjudicated disputes, diagnosed skin diseases, and taught the law. In the absence of formal government structures, the priesthood filled administrative roles. Aaron and his sons were not just religious officials, but national administrators. The tabernacle's presence meant the divine dwelt among the people, yet it also meant danger. The deaths of Nadab and Abihu demonstrated that proximity to the holy could be lethal. This reality shaped behavior. Israelites approached worship with appropriate fear. Reverence for the divine was not abstract doctrine, but survival instinct. The wilderness years tested obedience. Would Israel observe sabbatical food restrictions when manna stopped falling? Would they bring sacrifices when they possessed little? Would they remain sexually pure in the absence of social pressure? The law's effectiveness in the desert revealed whether commitment ran deep or remained superficial. Failure occurred repeatedly. The golden calf incident happened while Moses received the law. The spy's fearful report triggered rebellion. Complaints about food violated trust. Leviticus was given not to a faithful people, but to a rebellious one. The laws functioned as correction and discipline as much as instruction. Yet the laws additionally contained grace. The sacrificial system provided paths to restoration after failure. Purity laws established routes back to cleanness. Even after rebellion, mechanisms existed for renewal. The law included mercy within its strictness. The wilderness generation ultimately failed. They died in the desert, barred from entering Canaan. Yet their children, raised under the Levitical system, did enter. The laws succeeded in forming a new generation, shaped by covenant from childhood. What the Exodus generation could not fully embrace, their children absorbed naturally. This highlights Leviticus's long-term vision. The laws were not designed to produce immediate, perfect obedience. They aimed to shape a people over generations. Identity formation takes time. The wilderness years allowed Leviticus to accomplish its formative work. When Israel finally entered Canaan, they carried with them a complete religious and social system. They knew how to worship, how to organize, how to maintain purity, how to structure society. The wilderness years, far from being wasted time, were essential formation. Leviticus made the transition from slavery to nationhood possible. The book additionally prepared Israel for absence. The wilderness generation knew divine presence through visible pillars of cloud and fire. They ate miraculous bread. Water flowed from rocks. Yet future generations would not have these signs. They would need texts, rituals, and structures to maintain faith without constant miracles. Leviticus provided those structures. The festivals created occasions for remembering. The sacrifices maintained relationship through prescribed actions rather than spontaneous feelings. The laws gave shape to faithfulness when divine presence was not visible or tangible. The wilderness thus served as testing ground and training period. Leviticus shaped a people in the desert, preparing them for settlement. The laws created identity, maintained boundaries, addressed trauma, transmitted memory, provided order, and formed character. What began as refugees fleeing Egypt would emerge as a nation prepared to possess land and establish society according to covenant principles. The prophetic critique, beyond ritual to justice. Centuries after Leviticus was given at Sinai, prophets arose in Israel who spoke with divine authority. These prophets quoted, interpreted, and sometimes seemed to criticize the very laws Israel received in the wilderness. Understanding this prophetic engagement reveals Leviticus's true purpose. Isaiah opens his first chapter with a shocking divine statement. The divine is weary of sacrifices. He does not delight in the blood of bulls, lambs, and goats. Trampling the temple courts has become meaningless. Incense is an abomination. New moons and assemblies have become burdensome. This appears to contradict Leviticus entirely. The book prescribes exactly these sacrifices, festivals, and rituals. Yet Isaiah claims the divine now rejects them. Has the divine changed? Have the laws become obsolete? The answer emerges in Isaiah's next lines. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Remove evil from before my eyes. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. Isaiah's critique targets not the sacrificial system itself, but its divorce from justice. Israel offers worship while perpetrating injustice. They bring sacrifices while oppressing the vulnerable. They observe festivals while ignoring the fatherless and widow. The rituals continue, yet the ethical demands of Leviticus are violated. This reveals something crucial. Leviticus was never intended as merely ritual instruction. The book contains two inseparable components, worship and ethics. The sacrificial system exists to maintain relationship with the divine, yet that relationship demands justice and mercy. Ritual without righteousness is meaningless. Jeremiah echoes this theme. He stands in the temple gate and proclaims, "Do not trust in deceptive words that say, 'The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.'" The people believe that possessing the temple guarantees safety. Wrong. Jeremiah says, "Reform your ways and actions. Deal justly with one another. Do not oppress the foreigner, fatherless, or widow." Jeremiah explicitly connects to Leviticus's holiness code. "You shall be holy, for I am holy," meant living justly. The temple's presence does not override the covenant's ethical requirements. Worship at the sanctuary, while violating Leviticus's justice commands, is not faithfulness, but hypocrisy. Amos delivers perhaps the most stinging prophetic critique. The divine declares through him, "I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. Instead, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream." Amos preaches during a time of prosperity and active worship. Sacrifices are offered abundantly, festivals are observed with enthusiasm, yet society is rotten. The wealthy oppress the poor. Courts are corrupt, the vulnerable are crushed. The worship continues while justice vanishes. Amos's message is clear. The divine prefers no worship to hypocritical worship. Better to offer nothing than to pair rituals with injustice. The festivals Leviticus prescribes become offensive when separated from the justice Leviticus equally demands. Micah summarizes the prophetic position powerfully. What does the Lord ask of you? To do what is just, to embrace mercy, and to walk in humility with your God. Micah doesn't say God demands sacrifices, even though Leviticus lays them out. He's pointing to character, to conduct, to justice and mercy. This isn't about rejecting Leviticus, but about rediscovering its core. Leviticus 19 tells us, "Love your neighbor as yourself. Judge with fairness. Don't cheat anyone. Leave some of your harvest for those in need. Use honest measures." The ethical requirements aren't somehow secondary to the ritual ones. They're equal, or perhaps even primary. The prophets show us that Israel made a terrible error. They put ritual above ethics, treating the sacrificial system as though it were enough while ignoring justice. They read Leviticus selectively, emphasizing priests and offerings and festivals, while overlooking commands about the poor, the stranger, and the oppressed. This kind of selective reading continues throughout history. Religious people often prefer ritual to justice. Ritual can be contained, performed, completed. Justice is messy, it's costly, it's ongoing. It's easier to offer a sacrifice than to stand up for a widow. It's simpler to observe a festival than to reform a corrupt court. The prophets also criticize hollow repentance. Joel calls for people to tear their hearts, not just their clothes. External shows of remorse mean nothing without internal change. Bringing a sin offering accomplishes nothing if someone plans to repeat the sin. This connects to Leviticus's own provisions for intentional sin. The sacrificial system handled unintentional violations and ritual impurity, but deliberate, defiant rebellion received no sacrifice. The person who sinned with what they called a high hand was cut off from the community. The prophets are confronting a society engaged in exactly this kind of defiant sin while still expecting rituals to cover it. Hosea gives us that famous line, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice, knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." Jesus will quote this later, showing how important it remains. Mercy and knowing God supersede ritual performance. The relationship with God, expressed through justice, matters more than the rituals designed to maintain that relationship. Hosea is speaking during the northern kingdom's final years before the Assyrian conquest. Society has collapsed morally. Idolatry is everywhere, yet worship continues at shrines and altars. Hosea announces that God is not impressed. The rituals can't substitute for faithfulness. Malachi, writing after the exile, confronts a different problem: ritual contempt. Priests offer defiled food. Worshippers bring blind, lame, or sick animals for sacrifice. This violates Leviticus's clear commands that sacrificial animals must be without defect. The people have returned from exile but learned nothing. Malachi shows that both extremes are wrong. Hypocritical ritual paired with injustice is offensive. But sloppy ritual that shows contempt for God is equally wrong. The prophets aren't advocating abandoning Levitical worship, they're demanding it be performed with integrity and paired with justice. The prophetic critique also recovers Leviticus's concern for the vulnerable. The book repeatedly commands care for the poor, the foreigner, and the widow. These aren't minor additions, they're central covenant obligations. A society that neglects them violates the covenant, regardless of how carefully it observes ritual purity. The prophets reveal that Israel's problem wasn't the law itself, but their interpretation and application of it. They created a false split between worship and ethics, between ritual and justice. Leviticus contains no such division. Holiness encompasses both. The sacrificial system and the ethical code can't be separated. This understanding transforms how we read Leviticus. The book isn't a ritual manual with some ethical content thrown in. It's a holiness manual where ritual and ethics together make up the holy life. Worship maintains the relationship with God that produces justice. Justice demonstrates the authenticity of worship. The prophets also prepared the way for a new understanding. If the current ritual system fails to produce justice and righteousness, something more is needed. Jeremiah speaks of a new covenant written on hearts rather than stone tablets. Ezekiel envisions a new spirit enabling obedience. The prophets move beyond Leviticus toward something greater, yet they never abandon Leviticus. They quote it, appeal to it, assume its authority. Their critique isn't external but internal. They speak as covenant members, calling Israel back to the covenant's full requirements. Leviticus remains the standard, properly understood, for early Christians. The prophetic critique shaped their reading of Leviticus. Jesus quotes Hosea, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." He embodies the prophetic vision, healing on the Sabbath, touching lepers, eating with sinners. He fulfills the law by getting to its heart. Love God, love neighbor. The prophets teach that Leviticus's enduring message isn't about animal sacrifices or ritual purity, but about the character of holiness. A holy people practice justice. They care for the vulnerable. They deal honestly. They worship sincerely. The rituals serve this greater purpose. When ritual becomes an end in itself, divorced from justice, it fails entirely. Leviticus, through the prophetic lens, emerges as a book about forming a just and merciful society that reflects God's character. The sacrifices, festivals, and purity laws are means to this end. The prophets called Israel back to this understanding when they lost sight of it. Their critique remains relevant whenever religious observance detaches from justice. The New Testament lens, Jesus as the fulfillment. The New Testament writers, all Jewish and deeply familiar with the Torah, engaged Leviticus extensively. They saw in Jesus the fulfillment of patterns established in Leviticus, transforming the book's meaning while claiming continuity with it. The Gospel of John introduces Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This identification draws directly from Levitical sacrifices. Every morning and evening, a lamb was offered on the altar. During Passover, lambs were slain in remembrance of deliverance from Egypt. John claims Jesus embodies all these sacrifices. This interpretation transforms Leviticus's sacrificial system from repeated rituals into prophetic patterns, pointing toward a final, ultimate sacrifice. Every lamb offered over centuries testified to the need for atonement and pointed forward to the true lamb, whose blood would accomplish what animal blood only symbolized. The book of Hebrews develops this theme most fully. The author argues that the Levitical priesthood was temporary and imperfect. Priests offered repeated sacrifices daily and yearly because those sacrifices couldn't fully remove sin. They served a copy and shadow of heavenly realities, not the realities themselves. Jesus, Hebrews argues, is the true high priest, not from Aaron's line but from Melchizedek's order, predating the Levitical system. He enters not an earthly tent, but heaven itself. He offers not animal blood, but his own, and he does this once for all time, not repeatedly. The Day of Atonement becomes central to Hebrews' argument. On Yom Kippur, the high priest entered the most holy place once yearly with blood. Jesus entered heaven itself with his own blood, securing eternal redemption. The earthly ritual was a shadow of the heavenly reality. Hebrews also addresses the two goats of the Day of Atonement. One was slain, its blood taken into the Holy of Holies. The other carried sins into the wilderness. Jesus accomplishes both functions. His blood atones. He bears sins away, removing them completely. This interpretation doesn't negate Leviticus, but claims its completion. The sacrificial system wasn't wrong or misguided. It was preparatory, teaching, pointing toward what it couldn't itself accomplish. Animal blood was never the final solution, but always a temporary provision awaiting ultimate fulfillment. The New Testament also reinterprets purity. Leviticus established categories of clean and unclean, primarily concerning diet, bodily discharges, and disease. These laws created boundaries, marking Israel as distinct. Jesus challenges these boundaries. He touches lepers, making them clean rather than becoming unclean himself. He heals a woman with chronic bleeding. He declares all foods clean, abolishing dietary restrictions. The flow of purity reverses. Instead of defilement spreading from the impure to the pure, cleansing spreads from Jesus to the defiled. Peter's vision in Acts 10 shows this transformation dramatically. A sheet descends from heaven containing unclean animals. A voice commands, "Kill and eat." Peter protests, "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice responds, "Do not call impure what God has made clean." The immediate context is Gentile inclusion. Cornelius, a Gentile, sends for Peter. The vision prepares Peter to enter a Gentile home, something purity laws discouraged. The purity categories are being redefined. Uncleanness is not ritual but moral. Gentiles aren't inherently unclean. The ethnic boundary dissolves. Paul develops this theology extensively. He argues in Romans that circumcision, the mark of covenant inclusion, is now circumcision of the heart by the Spirit. External markers no longer determine covenant membership. Faith in Christ becomes the defining characteristic. Galatians addresses whether Gentile believers must observe Torah, including dietary laws and festivals. Paul argues forcefully against this. Christ has redeemed believers from the law's curse. Those who rely on works of law are under a curse. Justification comes through faith, not law, observance. This appears to completely overturn Leviticus, yet Paul insists he's not abolishing the law, but establishing it. The law's purpose was never to make people righteous through observance, but to reveal sin and point to Christ. Leviticus showed humanity's need for atonement, while foreshadowing how that atonement would come. The ethical commands of Leviticus persist in Paul's writings. Love your neighbor as yourself appears repeatedly. Commands about sexual morality, honesty, and justice remain binding. Paul distinguishes between ceremonial laws, sacrifices, purity, dietary restrictions, and moral laws, ethical commands. The former are fulfilled and transcended. The latter remain. Jesus himself makes similar distinctions. He summarizes the law. Love God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Both come from Torah, Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19. Jesus distills the law's essence, elevating these commands above ritual prescriptions. The New Testament also transforms the concept of priesthood. Under Leviticus, only Aaron's descendants could serve as priests. They mediated between God and people, offering sacrifices and entering sacred spaces forbidden to others. The system created unnecessary but exclusionary class. Peter declares that believers are a royal priesthood. Every follower of Christ participates in priesthood. The exclusive mediatorial role ends. All have access to God through Christ the high priest. The Levitical system is democratized and universalized. Revelation depicts heaven's worship using Levitical imagery. Lampstands, altars, incense, priestly garments all appear, yet they're transformed. The Lamb stands at the center, slain yet living. Saints from every nation worship. The temple is the Lord God and the Lamb. Leviticus's worship patterns continue, but fulfilled and perfected. The New Testament writers also address holiness. Leviticus's repeated command, "Be holy, for I am holy," appears in 1 Peter. But the means of achieving holiness shifts, not through ritual purity and sacrificial offerings, but through the Spirit's work. God sanctifies believers internally, transforming character rather than merely regulating behavior. This internalization fulfills the prophetic vision. Jeremiah's new covenant, written on hearts, becomes reality. Ezekiel's new spirit-enabling obedience is poured out at Pentecost. The external law of Leviticus becomes the internal law of the Spirit. Yet continuity persists. The goal remains holiness. The foundation remains God's character. The ethical demands remain. What changes is the means and the scope. Holiness is no longer maintained through ritual observance, but through union with Christ, and holiness extends beyond ethnic Israel to include all nations. The New Testament transformation of Leviticus sparked controversy. Jewish believers initially struggled with abandoning ancestral practices. The Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 addressed this. After debate, they decided not to burden Gentile believers with the full Torah, requiring only minimal restrictions. This decision represents a seismic shift. Leviticus shaped Jewish identity for over a millennium. Abandoning its ritual requirements meant reimagining what it meant to be God's people. The early church navigated this transition with difficulty, as evidenced by ongoing tensions between Jewish and Gentile Christians. From a Jewish perspective, Christian interpretation of Leviticus was problematic. The claim that Jesus fulfilled the sacrificial system implied that system was incomplete or inadequate. The abandonment of purity laws seemed to reject core aspects of Torah. Christianity appeared to be leaving Judaism behind. Yet Christians insisted they weren't rejecting but fulfilling. Jesus didn't come to abolish the law but to complete it. Leviticus pointed forward to Christ. Its types and shadows found substance in him. The ritual system was never meant to be permanent, but always preparatory. This debate continues across 2 millennia. Is Leviticus fulfilled and transcended in Christ, or does it remain binding? Are its ritual laws abrogated, or do they still apply? Different Christian traditions answer differently, and Judaism rejects the premise entirely. Regardless of theological positions, the New Testament's engagement with Leviticus shows the book's enduring significance. It provided the conceptual framework, the vocabulary, and the patterns through which early Christians understood Jesus. Lamb, priest, sacrifice, atonement, holiness, all these concepts come from Leviticus. Without Leviticus, the New Testament becomes incomprehensible. The claim that Christ died for sins makes sense only against the backdrop of the sacrificial system. The priesthood of Christ requires understanding the Levitical priesthood. The purity Jesus brings presupposes the impurity Leviticus addresses. Leviticus thus becomes foundational even for those who believe its specific commands are no longer binding. It establishes the theological categories that Christianity both inherits and transforms. The book's vision of holiness, its mechanism of atonement, and its call to reflect God's character persist even as the specific means change. The Pauline Revolution, from clean, unclean to Jew, Gentile. When Paul encountered Christ on the Damascus Road, he was a Pharisee, zealous for the law. His entire identity was wrapped up in Torah observance. Leviticus shaped his understanding of holiness, purity, and covenant belonging. His conversion sparked a theological revolution centered on reinterpreting Leviticus's categories. Paul's letters reveal an ongoing struggle to articulate how Gentiles relate to Leviticus. The book was given to Israel at Sinai. Its laws defined Jewish identity. Yet Paul proclaimed that Gentiles could become full covenant members without adopting these laws. This claim seemed to undermine Leviticus entirely. The issue crystallized around specific practices: circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, and festival keeping. All came from Torah. All marked Jewish distinctiveness. All were, according to Paul, unnecessary for Gentile believers. This was revolutionary, even shocking. Galatians addresses the controversy most directly. Judaizers, Jewish Christians who insisted Gentiles must observe Torah, had infiltrated the Galatian churches. They taught that faith in Christ was insufficient without circumcision and law observance. Paul responds with fierce opposition. He argues that justification comes through faith, not works of law. Abraham was counted righteous by faith before circumcision was instituted. The law came 430 years after Abraham's promise. The promise precedes and supersedes the law. Those who rely on law observance are under a curse because no one keeps it perfectly. Paul's argument seems to pit law against gospel, Moses against Christ. Yet he insists the law wasn't bad. It served a purpose: to reveal sin and act as a guardian until Christ came. Like a tutor or custodian watching children until they mature, the law was temporary, preparing for something greater. The purity laws receive similar treatment. In Romans 14, Paul addresses disputes about food. Some believe they can eat anything. Others eat only vegetables, avoiding meat potentially sacrificed to idols or violating dietary laws. Paul declares that nothing is unclean in itself. The categories of clean and unclean no longer apply. This directly contradicts Leviticus. The book clearly labels certain animals unclean. Yet Paul says uncleanness isn't inherent but a matter of conscience. If someone believes something is unclean, for them it is, but objectively all foods are clean. The Levitical categories have been abolished. Colossians goes further. Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These were a shadow of things to come. The reality is found in Christ. Dietary laws, festivals, Sabbaths, all are shadows. Christ is the substance. This language of shadow and substance, type and antitype, became central to Christian interpretation. Leviticus wasn't wrong, but preliminary. Its laws weren't arbitrary, but purposeful, pointing beyond themselves. Animal sacrifices anticipated Christ's sacrifice. Purity laws illustrated moral holiness. Festivals foreshadowed spiritual realities. The Jew-Gentile divide became the crucial interpretive key. Under Leviticus, clear boundaries separated Israel from nations. Dietary laws prevented shared meals. Purity regulations discouraged close contact. Circumcision marked covenant membership. These boundaries reinforced ethnic and religious separation. Paul argues that Christ abolished these boundaries. In Christ, there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. All are one. The dividing wall of hostility has been torn down. The laws, commands, and regulations that created separation are abolished. Ephesians develops this theme. Christ is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity, thus making peace. The law with its commandments and regulations refers to Leviticus's boundary markers. These laws, which maintained Israel's separateness, are abolished to create a unified people including both Jew and Gentile. Unity requires removing the barriers Leviticus established. This raised an urgent question. If Leviticus's laws no longer bind, what prevents moral chaos? If dietary restrictions are gone, what about sexual restrictions? If Sabbath observance is optional, what about honesty and justice? Paul must distinguish between laws that are abolished and those that persist. His answer involves categorization. Ceremonial laws, those concerning ritual, purity, and worship, are fulfilled in Christ and no longer binding. Moral laws, those concerning ethics, justice, and relationships, remain in force. Love your neighbor as yourself still applies. Sexual immorality is still prohibited. Justice is still required. This distinction, though not explicit in Torah itself, became essential for Christian ethics. It allowed the Church to maintain moral standards from Leviticus while abandoning ritual requirements. The ethical holiness code remains. The purity code is transcended. Paul's letters repeatedly quote Leviticus's ethical commands. He condemns sexual immorality, referencing Leviticus 18. He commands love of neighbor, quoting Leviticus 19. He demands justice and honesty, echoing Levitical principles. The moral content persists even as the ritual form changes. The Holy Spirit's role becomes central. Under Leviticus, external rituals maintained holiness, sacrifices atoned for sin, purity laws prevented contamination. The system was external and physical. Paul argues that the Spirit now accomplishes what the law could not: internal transformation. Romans 8 contrasts law and spirit. The law was weakened by the flesh and couldn't produce righteousness. But God sent his Son, and through the Spirit, the law's requirements are fulfilled in those who walk by the Spirit. The goal remains the same: holiness. But the means shifts from external observance to internal empowerment. Galatians 5 describes this transformation. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. The Spirit produces character that transcends law. This Spirit-empowered life fulfills what Leviticus aimed for but couldn't achieve. Leviticus commanded holiness but provided only external mechanisms. The Spirit writes the law on hearts, enabling obedience from within. The new covenant Jeremiah promised becomes reality. The Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 demonstrates this theology in practice. Gentile believers are multiplying. Questions arise. Must they be circumcised? Must they observe Torah? Peter, Paul, and Barnabas argue against requiring this. James proposes a compromise. Abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. This decision is revolutionary. The full Levitical system isn't imposed on Gentiles. Only minimal restrictions apply, primarily to avoid offending Jewish sensibilities and maintain fellowship between Jewish and Gentile believers. The door opens wide for Gentile inclusion without requiring adoption of Jewish identity markers. Yet tensions persisted. Jewish believers continued observing Torah. Paul himself participated in temple rituals in Acts. the Jerusalem church remained Torah observant. The question wasn't whether Jews should abandon Leviticus, but whether Gentiles must adopt it. Paul argued they need not. This created a diverse early church. Jewish Christians kept kosher, observed Sabbath, and celebrated festivals. Gentile Christians did not. Both were considered legitimate expressions of faith. Unity existed despite different practices, based on shared faith in Christ rather than shared ritual observance. Over time, this balance shifted as Gentile Christians became the majority and Jewish Christians diminished. The church became increasingly non-observant of Levitical law. Eventually, even Jewish Christians largely abandoned distinctive practices. Christianity became a primarily Gentile religion with minimal connection to its Jewish roots. Paul's revolution thus had far-reaching consequences. It enabled Christianity's rapid spread beyond Judaism. It removed barriers to Gentile conversion. It created a universal faith, not limited by ethnic or cultural boundaries. But it also severed connections to the law that shaped Jesus' own identity. The Pauline interpretation of Leviticus remains controversial. Messianic Jews today argue that Jewish believers should maintain Torah observance. Some Christians advocate for recovery of biblical feasts and dietary laws. Others see these as unnecessary and potentially legalistic. Regardless of contemporary practice, Paul's theological move was decisive. He transformed Leviticus from binding law for God's people into fulfilled pattern completed in Christ. The ritual requirements no longer obligate. The ethical demands persist. The book's categories, clean, unclean, holy, common, are reinterpreted through the lens of Jew-Gentile unity in Christ. This interpretation enabled the Church to read Leviticus as Christian scripture without being bound by its specific commands. The book retains authority as divine revelation pointing toward Christ, even as its particular regulations no longer govern Christian practice. Paul's revolution made Leviticus simultaneously foundational and transcended, fulfilled and complete. Echoes in modernity. Law, ethics, and society. Leviticus, though ancient, continues shaping modern thought in surprising ways. Its concepts, categories, and concerns echo through Western law, ethics, social justice movements, and contemporary debates. The book's influence persists even among those unfamiliar with its content. The most obvious legacy is the concept of law itself. Leviticus presents detailed, codified regulations touching all aspects of life. This comprehensive legal vision influenced Western legal tradition. The idea that society should be governed by written law rather than arbitrary power owes much to biblical legal texts. Specific legal concepts also trace back to Leviticus. The principle of proportional justice, punishment fitting the crime, appears in an eye for an eye. Though often misunderstood as advocating vengeance, this principle actually limited retaliation, preventing escalation. It established, measured, proportional response rather than unlimited revenge. The concept of sanctuary or asylum has Levitical roots. Cities of refuge provided protection for accidental manslayers. This idea that the accused deserved protection until fairly tried influenced legal traditions of asylum and due process. Modern refugee law and political asylum concepts echo this ancient provision. Jubilee principles influenced economic thought. The idea that debts should be periodically forgiven, that land shouldn't be permanently alienated, that economic inequality should have limits, all come from Leviticus 25. Social justice movements have repeatedly invoked Jubilee when advocating debt relief or economic redistribution. The Jubilee 2000 campaign sought cancellation of developing nations' debt. Organizers explicitly reference biblical Jubilee, arguing that crushing debt burdens should be released. Whether one agrees with the economics, the campaign demonstrates Leviticus's continuing relevance in public discourse. Land reform movements have also drawn on Jubilee. The principle that land belongs ultimately to God and can't be permanently sold, challenged feudal and colonial land systems. Movements for indigenous land rights sometimes invoke this theological claim that land can't be absolutely owned. Leviticus's concern for the vulnerable shaped Western charity and welfare concepts, the requirement to leave gleanings for the poor, not to harvest field corners, to allow the needy to gather fallen fruit. These establish that society owes support to the poor as a matter of justice, not mere charity. Modern welfare states, food banks, and social safety nets reflect this understanding. Society has obligations to ensure basic needs are met. This differs from pure market capitalism or survival of the fittest. The vulnerable have claims on communal resources, a Levitical principle. The labor movement found support in Levitical Sabbath principles. If even God rested, and if Israel must rest weekly, then workers deserve rest. The campaign for the 8-hour workday and the weekend drew on Sabbath theology. Humans aren't mere units of production, but image-bearers deserving regular rest. Environmental ethics increasingly references Levitical land Sabbaths. The command to let land rest every 7th year recognizes limits to exploitation. Modern sustainability movements advocate similar restraint. The land isn't merely a resource to exhaust, but a trust to maintain. This ecological wisdom comes partly from Leviticus. Medical ethics also bears Levitical influence. The priestly role in diagnosing and isolating disease influenced public health concepts of quarantine. The detailed attention to bodily health as connected to community well-being shaped Western medicine's public health orientation. The concept of informed consent in medical ethics has roots in respecting bodily autonomy, a principle visible in Levitical laws about bodily discharges and purity. A person's body is their own, not subject to violation without consent. This foundational medical ethics principle has biblical precedent. Sexual ethics remain deeply influenced by Leviticus. Prohibitions on certain sexual behaviors in Leviticus 18 shaped Western legal and moral codes for centuries. Modern debates about sexual morality still reference these texts, whether arguing for traditional standards or critiquing them. The contemporary LGBTQ+ rights movement particularly engages Leviticus. 2 verses prohibit male same-sex relations. These texts have been used to justify discrimination. Progressive interpreters attempt to contextualize or reinterpret them. Conservative interpreters maintain their binding authority. Either way, Leviticus remains central to the debate. Animal welfare movements sometimes invoke Levitical principles. The command not to boil a kid in its mother's milk suggests concern for animal dignity. Prohibitions on certain cruelties recognize that animals deserve humane treatment. Though Leviticus permits animal sacrifice and consumption, it regulates treatment, suggesting limits to exploitation. The concept of blood sacredness influenced medical practice. Blood transfusions faced religious objection, partly based on Levitical prohibitions on consuming blood. Though most Christians now accept transfusions, the debate shows Leviticus's ongoing influence on medical ethics. Dietary movements reference Leviticus. Kosher and halal practices directly derive from biblical dietary laws, but broader movements toward mindful, ethical eating sometimes invoke Levitical principles. Paying attention to food sources, recognizing eating as spiritually significant, making conscious choices about consumption. The idea that purity and impurity are moral categories rather than merely physical remains influential. Something can be legally permissible, yet morally polluting. This distinction, visible in Leviticus, shapes how societies think about pornography, violence in media, and other moral but not necessarily legal questions. Social categories of clean and unclean persist, though usually unconsciously. Mary Douglas's anthropological work showed how purity systems create social order. Modern societies still maintain boundaries about what is acceptable or unacceptable, proper or improper. Leviticus's purity system reveals the structure underlying such categorical thinking. The concept of holiness as separation, being set apart for special purpose, influences how people think about sacred spaces, times, and roles. Churches, temples, mosques maintain this idea. Certain vocations are seen as callings. Special occasions are marked off from ordinary time. These practices echo Levitical thinking. Restorative justice movements draw on Levitical restitution principles. Beyond punishment, wrongdoers should restore what was taken or damaged. Victims deserve recompense. The relationship should be repaired. This approach, visible in Leviticus's laws about restitution, offers alternatives to purely punitive justice. The idea that justice must be impartial, that different standards shouldn't apply to rich and poor, powerful and weak, comes from Leviticus. The command to judge fairly, neither favoring the poor out of pity nor the rich out of fear, established equal justice as a standard Western legal systems claim to uphold. Business ethics references Levitical commands about honest weights and measures. Fair dealing, transparent transactions, integrity in commerce all have Levitical precedent. The idea that economic activity has moral dimensions and should be conducted justly comes partly from texts like Leviticus 19. Even secular ethicists often unknowingly employ Levitical categories. The golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated, is Leviticus's love your neighbor as yourself, in different words. This principle, central to Western ethics, originates in Leviticus 19. The human rights movement draws on the conviction that humans possess inherent dignity. While this concept has multiple sources, the biblical idea that humans are made in God's image contributes. Leviticus's detailed concern for human welfare and dignity feeds into this tradition. The concept of collective responsibility, that societies bear responsibility for injustice within them, comes partly from Levitical thinking. The Day of Atonement addressed national, corporate sin. Modern movements for truth and reconciliation, reparations, and addressing systemic injustice echo this corporate understanding. Leviticus's influence extends into areas its authors never imagined. Modern debates about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and technology ethics grapple with questions about what is natural, what violates created order, what transgresses boundaries. These questions employ Levitical categories applied to new contexts. The book also influences how people think about community. Leviticus envisions society as interconnected, where individual choices affect collective well-being. This communal orientation challenges modern individualism. The idea that private behavior has public consequences comes partly from Levitical thought. Leviticus's vision of a society oriented toward justice, mercy, and holiness remains compelling even for those who reject specific regulations. The aspiration toward a better world, a more just society, a more merciful community, these hopes find expression in Leviticus. The book's enduring relevance lies not in specific rules about sacrifices or clean animals, but in its comprehensive vision of holiness touching all life. It insists that religion can't be compartmentalized, that God cares about economics, sexuality, justice, and mercy as much as worship. This integrated vision continues challenging compartmentalized modern life. Whether consciously or not, Western civilization carries Leviticus's imprint. Its concepts shape law, ethics, social movements, and moral reasoning. Even critiques of Leviticus often employ categories and concerns derived from it. The book remains foundational to Western thought, an ancient text whose influence persists 3 millennia after it was written. Why Leviticus matters. The search for a holy common life. We return at the end to the beginning. Israel stands at Sinai. The tabernacle is complete. God's glory fills the tent. The question that opened Leviticus echoes still. How can a holy God dwell among sinful people without destroying them? Leviticus answers with a system: sacrifices to atone, purity laws to maintain boundaries, ethical commands to shape behavior, festivals to sanctify time, priests to mediate. The system is intricate, comprehensive, touching every aspect of life. Nothing remains outside its scope. But beneath the details lies a vision. God desires nearness. The entire elaborate structure exists for one purpose: to make possible sustained divine presence among humanity. The tabernacle at the camp center symbolizes this. God chooses to dwell not remotely in heaven, but intimately among the tents of his people. This divine desire for proximity is the book's animating principle. Everything else serves it. The sacrifices remove the barrier of sin. The purity laws train people to distinguish holy from common. The ethical code makes them fit companions for a holy God. The festivals create regular encounters. The whole system facilitates relationship. The book reveals that holiness isn't primarily about rules, but about relationship. God says, "Be holy, for I am holy." This isn't arbitrary demand, but invitation into likeness. To be holy means to reflect God's character: just, merciful, faithful, compassionate. The laws provide the curriculum for this formation. Leviticus also takes sin seriously. Modern culture often treats wrongdoing casually, as inevitable or excusable. Leviticus allows no such luxury. Sin damages relationship with God. It creates real separation. It pollutes the sanctuary. It threatens divine presence. The sacrificial system exists because sin is genuinely serious. Yet the system's very existence demonstrates grace. God provides the means of restoration. He prescribes the sacrifices. He establishes the Day of Atonement. He creates paths back to relationship after failure. The law isn't burden but gift, a gracious provision for maintaining the relationship God desires. The book also insists on embodiment. Relationship with God isn't abstract spirituality, but physical reality. What you eat matters. How you treat your body matters. Sexual behavior matters. Business practices matter. Leviticus refuses to separate spiritual from physical, sacred from secular. All life is potentially holy. This integration challenges modern compartmentalization. We divide life into religious and non-religious spheres. Leviticus knows no such division. Worship and work, prayer and commerce, ritual and ethics all belong together. Holiness transforms everything, or it transforms nothing. The communal dimension also matters. Holiness isn't individual achievement, but corporate identity. Israel as a whole is called to be holy. Individual actions affect communal standing. The Day of Atonement addresses national sin. The Jubilee resets social structures. Holiness has social, economic, and political dimensions. This corporate vision critiques individualistic religion. Personal piety matters, but not alone. Justice in society matters. Economic structures matter. How the vulnerable are treated matters. True holiness encompasses all these. A society can be religiously observant yet unjust, and therefore not holy. Leviticus's vision of justice particularly stands out. The laws about gleaning, honest weights, the sabbatical year, and Jubilee create an economic system oriented toward fairness and mercy. Inequality has limits. The poor have rights. Economic life operates under divine oversight. Wealth and property aren't absolute, but held in trust. This economic vision challenges both ancient and modern systems that concentrate wealth and power. Leviticus imagines an economy serving human flourishing, not endless accumulation. It protects the vulnerable, prevents permanent poverty, and maintains human dignity. These principles remain radical. The book also addresses the human need for meaning and structure. Life without pattern can feel chaotic and purposeless. Leviticus provides rhythm. Daily sacrifices, weekly Sabbaths, seasonal festivals, sabbatical years, Jubilee. Time is sanctified, given shape and significance. This creates stability and identity. The festivals especially accomplish this. They root people in story, connecting present to past. Passover recalls deliverance. Tabernacles remembers wilderness dependence. The Day of Atonement acknowledges sin and celebrates forgiveness. These observances make abstract theology concrete and experiential. Leviticus also confronts death and decay. Purity laws address bodily discharges, disease, and death, all signs of a world fallen from Eden's perfection. The regulations acknowledge brokenness while providing paths through it. Life continues despite death's presence. Cleanness can be restored. This realism about human existence matters. Leviticus doesn't pretend away suffering, disease, or mortality. It faces these realities squarely, while insisting they need not have the final word. Ritual provides means of processing trauma, grief, and fear. The system addresses psychological and spiritual needs, not just theological ones. The priesthood represents another key element, the need for mediation. Humans can't approach God casually. The sanctuary is dangerous. Holiness can consume. Priests stand between, making approach possible. They represent both God to people and people to God. This mediatorial role acknowledges human limitations while providing access. We need help approaching the holy. We require guidance and representation. The priesthood fills this need, showing that relationship with God, though desired by God, requires careful navigation. For Christians, Jesus fulfills all these roles: sacrifice, priest, mediator, atoning offering. Leviticus's structures find their completion in him. Yet the book remains valuable even for those who believe it's fulfilled. It shows what Christ fulfilled, explains why his death matters, and provides categories for understanding atonement. Jewish tradition continues engaging Leviticus directly. Though sacrifice ceased with the temple's destruction, the laws shape Jewish identity, ethics, and practice. The Holiness Code guides moral life. The festivals structure the year. The book remains living Torah, studied and applied, not merely a historical artifact. For all readers, Leviticus raises ultimate questions. What does it mean to be holy? How should communities organize themselves? What obligations do we have toward God and neighbor? How do we deal with sin and failure? What makes for justice? These questions transcend any particular religious tradition. The book's enduring relevance lies in its comprehensive vision. It doesn't separate worship from ethics, religion from economics, spirituality from social justice. It envisions an integrated holy life where every action reflects divine character and every relationship embodies covenant faithfulness. Leviticus challenges shallow religion content with ritual observance while tolerating injustice. It confronts hypocrisy that claims holiness while oppressing the vulnerable. It demands consistency between worship and daily life, between what we profess and how we live. Yet it also offers hope. The sacrificial system shows that failure need not be final. The Day of Atonement demonstrates God's willingness to forgive and restore. The Jubilee reveals divine commitment to justice and renewal. Leviticus presents a God who takes sin seriously, but delights in mercy. The book also reveals divine accommodation. God could have remained utterly transcendent, unapproachable, separate. Instead, God designs an elaborate system to enable nearness. The tabernacle, the priesthood, the sacrifices, all exist because God desires relationship enough to make it possible. This divine desire for nearness is Leviticus's deepest truth. The holy God chooses to dwell with unholy people. This choice drives everything else. The laws exist to facilitate this astonishing reality: God with us. Leviticus concludes not with an ending, but an ellipsis. The story continues. The journey from Sinai to Canaan lies ahead. The laws will be tested. The vision will be pursued, often imperfectly. Failures will come. Yet the covenant holds. God remains committed. 3 millennia later, the search for holy common life continues. Humans still struggle with sin, injustice, and brokenness. We still yearn for meaning, purpose, and divine presence. We still need structure, forgiveness, and restoration. The questions Leviticus addresses remain our questions. The book offers not easy answers, but a vision of God dwelling among people, of communities shaped by justice and mercy, of lives oriented toward holiness, of relationships restored through grace. This vision, proclaimed from an ancient mountain to a wandering people, echoes still. Leviticus matters because it insists on taking seriously both human sinfulness and divine grace, both justice and mercy, both individual responsibility and communal solidarity. It refuses to simplify what is complex or to compartmentalize what is integrated. It matters because it shows that God cares not just about souls, but about bodies, not just about worship, but about economics, not just about belief, but about behavior. Religion that doesn't touch all of life isn't the religion of Leviticus. It matters because it presents a God who is both utterly holy and relentlessly committed to relationship. The transcendent God becomes immanent. The separate God draws near. The holy God makes holiness possible for the unholy. Ultimately, Leviticus matters because it testifies to an ancient, persistent hope that God and humanity might dwell together, that holiness might transform communities, that justice and mercy might prevail, that the sacred might permeate all existence. This hope endures. The search continues, the vision beckons still.